Tonight, I, Valeria Morales, walk into Bianchi's in a pair of faded jeans to meet the Whitmore family. They think I'm just an ordinary single mom. Perfect. Because behind this old cotton blouse is the founder of a financial empire. When Reginald talks down to Adrian, when Charlotte scrutinizes the scuffs on my shoes, a single phone call will flip the entire room. They don't know the chef will greet me like family, the wine cellar will open, and the truth will smash straight through every prejudice. I was already halfway through the lie when the phone in my palm began to vibrate, the vibration I'd assigned to decisions that could move markets. Enzo, the maitre d' at Bianchi's, lifted one elegant eyebrow in my direction, as if to say, "Are you ready to detonate this room?" I smiled like any other mother trying not to embarrass her son and answered in a voice I hadn't used in 30 years of PTA nights and budget dinners. Morales. On the other end, Harrington was out of breath. The London board wanted a final read before papers hit the wire at dawn their time. I kept my gaze on the Whitmore table, a gleaming rectangle of glass near the window, where the skyline looked like money wrapped in evening light. Reginald Whitmore's posture belonged to a man used to being the most important person in any room. Charlotte held her flute of champagne as if it were a title deed. Between them sat their daughter, Isabella Whitmore, Bella, whose eyes softened whenever they drifted to my son. 30 million is within exposure, I said, letting the number carry just enough. But nobody sets foot in Paris without hedges in place. We don't marry expansion to hope, we marry it to math. The conversation at the Whitmore table stalled like a stalled elevator. Even from 20 feet away, I felt their attention tilt toward me. Good. I made a note. Small pause, softer timbre, and said the line that would rotate every compass point in that restaurant. If Goldman wants more than 30 minutes, they can bring me a better model. We don't reward intellectually lazy money. A small silence followed, bright and sharp as a pin. Then I softened. Yes, Harrington. Wheels up Tuesday. Tokyo call at 11 tonight. Tell compliance to pre-clear the ESG language. If they balk, there's no deal. I ended the call and tucked the lie back behind my smile. For 30 years I had used two voices. Tonight, they would have to meet. I caught sight of my son in the glass, Adrian in a charcoal suit that made him look like the man I'd been raising while pretending we were short on bus fare. His hands were in his pockets, chin tilted, amused and bewildered all at once. The elevator doors whispered open behind us. Somewhere down the hallway, Bianchi's kitchen thundered with service. Metal on metal, flame on skillet, a choir of hands building miracles. I trusted that sound more than I trusted most boardrooms. "Mom," Adrian said gently, trying to tug me back into the quieter self he knew. "You sure you're okay with this?" "Perfectly." I smoothed a wrinkle on my cotton blouse and looked at the shoes I had polished until the scuffs wrote their own history anyway. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's meet the people who will test what we believe." He offered his arm, the way Diego used to when we still crashed faculty parties at Columbia and laughed into the night because the rent was due and the world didn't know us yet. Now, the city did. Now I pretended it didn't. Enzo glided ahead, all grace and dimples, his voice a velvet rope. "Miss Morales? Mr. Morales, this way?" His glance said I'm keeping the secret, and my wink said thank you. We stepped past tables weighted with silver, attention sliding toward Adrian the way attention always slid toward beauty. He wore his father's height like a borrowed suit that had finally been tailored. I wore silence like armor. At the Whitmore table, the theater began. Reginald rose, offering a hand like a promissory note. "Reginald Whitmore." He said his name the way some men say legacy. Charlotte gave me the practiced nod of a woman who'd been in 100 rooms like this and memorized the pecking order before appetizers. Bella stood with a warmth that blew through all that performance. Her hug was uncomplicated, so I returned it. "Please call me Valeria," I said. "Mrs. Morales is for letters from the IRS." "Bella," she said, and her eyes found Adrian as if there were no one else in New York. The world's expensive edges disappeared for a breath. We sat. The waiter poured. Champagne hissed like a well-kept secret. I lifted my menu, the one I'd helped design years ago when Bianchi's looked like a dream scribbled on butcher paper, and pretended to read. "So," Charlotte began, testing me with porcelain cheer. "Daniel mentioned," she caught herself corrected. "Adrian mentioned that you work in, What was it, dear? Corporate finance, Adrian answered smoothly, because I had taught him to protect people who weren't yet ready to be asked the wrong questions. Same company since before I was born. How quaint, Charlotte said, and the word perched on her gloss like a little bird that didn't know it was made of teeth. Loyalty these days. And what position do you hold, Miss Morales? I manage investments, I said, and left it there like an empty chair. Clerical? She pressed, smiling with a softness that could cut. Something like that? Something like that, I returned, matching her smile exactly. I could do this politely all night, or for 1 minute. It was up to them. Reginald turned to Adrian, effectively dismissing me. He asked about City College, with the complicated pity of a man who paid for a wing with his last name on it. Adrian refused to bristle, and offered simple excellence instead. His students, their first-generation courage, the journals that had published his work without asking who his father was. Bella leaned forward proudly and gave my son back the truth he had earned. It pleased me. The clarity of it, the ease. It irked Charlotte. Some women prefer diamonds to merit because diamonds don't talk back. Our appetizers rose like small sculptures. I tasted and remembered the night Lorenzo Bianchi and I argued about salt until 2 a.m, neither of us willing to compromise until flavor said mercy. A tiny, traitorous smile found me. Where did you grow up, Valeria? Charlotte asked, which was a question that could be a hand extended or a trapdoor. Your accent, so musical, south of here. San Juan, I said. Puerto Rico. How lovely, she said, as if lovely was a tray on which to carry someone else's life. And when did you arrive in the States? I was born a U.S. citizen, I reminded her, gentle and unmovable as a courthouse. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Color climbed her neck, then retreated under a smile that promised she would not be scolded in her own mind. Of course, I meant when did you come to the mainland? 17, I said. I moved for school. Reginald perked. Where? Cambridge. Harvard? Is hope for a familiar flag. Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I said, and watched surprise perform a small ballet across his face. On scholarship? He said, and the way he said scholarship told me exactly how deep his equity in his own origin story went. On work, I said, and on very little sleep. It would have been clean and possibly merciful to stop there. Then Harrington called. Now the fuse had burned down to the powder. I excused myself with a smile, stood within earshot, and let the world I actually lived in come out of my mouth like a second language that was finally allowed to be first. The numbers were precise, the conditions firm, the kindness professional, and no more. I negotiated with elegant impatience. I allowed the word jet to exist. I mentioned the Tokyo call at 11 because it was true, and truth wears better than silk. When I finished, I apologized for the interruption as if I'd just stepped away to check on a roast. That sounded significant, Reginald said, suddenly hungry for complexity, where 5 minutes earlier he had only been hungry for control. End of quarter, I said. Nothing that can't wait until dessert. Before he could wring another drop of comfort out of that sentence, a new weather system blew into the room. Lorenzo Bianchi was halfway across the dining floor, booming my name like a bell he'd been waiting to ring. Valeria, mia cara, what is this? Jeans? You come undercover to my house? He kissed both my cheeks and called me dramatic in front of people who own drama in bulk. The room turned its head. He squeezed Adrian's shoulder as if he'd been waiting to see whether the boy had become a man, then glanced at the Whitmores with the kind politeness of a man who'd cooked for presidents and knew how to value a busboy. I introduced everyone. Charlotte's smile worked overtime to keep from cracking. Chef Bianchi, Reginald said, extending a hand. An honor. I've been trying to. Please, Lorenzo cut him off gently. Tonight we do not talk business. We talk about love and risotto. He turned back to me. The cellar is at your service. The table by the window was saved for you. Enzo told me you asked for discretion. My mother will scold me if I do not hug you again. He did. I let him. The hug was not strategy. It was history. When he returned to the kitchen, the table felt like a chessboard when a queen appears where a pawn was standing. Charlotte swallowed. Reginald recalculated. Bella's eyes shone with a something like relief. She had known there was more, and now she could name it. Adrian looked at me as if we were in on a joke too kind to tell. We ate. We performed civility, while the room rewired its opinion. You live in Queens, is that right? Charlotte asked after a time, pronouncing Queens with the trepidation of a person experimenting with hot sauce. So diverse. I keep an apartment there, I said. The best empanadas on earth are within 10 minutes of my front door. The rest of the week I am a slave to this city's view. I let Tribeca hang like a moon. You have 2 residences, she said, unable to swallow the math, on a clerical salary. That almost earned a laugh. I set my knife down with care. Adrian's knee brushed mine under the table, the subtle Morse code we'd invented when he was little for you good. I am now, I thought. I am now. I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my work, I said to my son, because truth belongs to the people you raise before it belongs to anybody else. We'll talk tonight, darling. At home. I looked back to the Whitmores and let the steel in my spine show. I didn't join my company. I built it. Reginald opened and closed his mouth once, twice. You founded Morale's Financial Systems, I said. We started in a borrowed room with 2 servers, 3 good ideas, and a coffee pot that tried to kill us. We're bigger now. How big? He couldn't help himself. Money is a language that makes some people fluent in manners and others illiterate. Big enough to apologize to my son for what I didn't tell him sooner, I said, and lifted my water. To good choices, and to better ones. What came next was inevitable. Lorenzo reappeared, and this time Lucia, his mother, walked beside him in chef whites pressed like a declaration. She called me foolish for not warning her I was coming and kissed my forehead as if I had not aged for her one bit since the day we decided to invest in hope. Charlotte watched the affection like a cat watches rain, incapable of knowing where to put it. Shall we? Lorenzo asked quietly when the main courses had been cleared. Let's, I said. The cellar at Bianchi's is a chapel built to worship time. Wood and stone and glass and quiet. Enzo unlocked the frosted door as if he were being kind to a secret and let us down into cool air that smelled like cedar and patience. Reginald stopped speaking. Charlotte's eyes widened, the way eyes widen when a person sees scale for the first time and realizes how small they've been. Lorenzo pulled a bottle from a rack I knew better than some of my own drawers and held it to the light with a smile like a story. For Diego, he said. From Spain. The year on the label unstitched a memory in me so clean I could have sworn I smelled sea breeze. Diego's hand on my hip in a vineyard nobody had heard of. The 2 of us plotting futures, like kids with a map. I nodded, because if I spoke I would forgive the whole world, and I needed my edges tonight. We tasted. We toasted. Reginald attempted to make philanthropy sound like a private club only he knew the password to, and I let the words drift past while the wine did what it was made to do, teach us that time is generous when we respect it. Charlotte asked about collections. Bella asked about curators whose names meant hunger and courage rather than pedigree. Adrian closed his eyes and allowed what he loved, stories, to mix with what he was learning to love in new ways. Systems, structure, the architecture beneath elegance. Do you offer private tastings? Charlotte asked at last, her voice caught between performance and yearning. For investors and friends, Lorenzo said, handing me the cork, like we were passing a baton in a relay we'd been running for 20 years. He turned to Adrian. Your mother has better ears than most sommeliers, he said, and it wasn't a compliment so much as a memory. She hears regions. Mom? Adrian said softly, tasting the word like it had a second meaning. We come here when the world forgets to be kind, I told him. Food has a way of making honesty inevitable. Back upstairs, the city had fallen into that late hour when even power grows quiet. Enzo intercepted us before we reached the table. Miss Morales, your Tokyo call is confirmed for 11. Mr. Shaw has the documentation waiting in your office, if you'd like the car brought around. Thank you, Enzo. I looked at Adrian. I'd meant to keep these rooms separate for 2 more years. 35 had seemed like an age at which a man could meet his mother's whole life without resenting it. I realized I had set the date to protect myself, not him. You want to sit in? I asked, his face lit with the curiosity that has always been his better angel. Really? Really, I said. We'll talk afterward. I owe you more than a car ride's worth of answers. Charlotte brightened as if the invitation had included her. We're staying in Midtown, she said quickly. Perhaps we could share. I've already asked Ramon to bring another car for you, I said kindly. It's much more convenient. Reginald hid his disappointment poorly. Bella hid her amusement well. Outside, the city lifted its shoulder up to the car door like an old friend. Ramon held it open, murmured, "Evening, Miss Morales," and pretended not to notice the Whitmores recalculating their own narrative at the curb. Adrian slid in beside me and stared out at Tribeca, glittering like 1,000 true things we never said. When the privacy partition rose, he turned. "How much of tonight was planned?" he asked. "All of it," I said, "and none of it." He waited. I gave him the rest. I wore jeans to make them choose. I took the call to make them listen. I let Lorenzo be Lorenzo because love doesn't need a cue. I wanted them to show you who they are before I showed them who I am. That's how you measure character. It's not about money, it's about gravity, what people bend toward when they think nobody important is watching. "And me?" His voice was careful now, a man making room for a boy inside his ribs. "What did you want me to see?" "That I am both women," I said. "The one who counts pennies at the kitchen table and the one who moves decimal points over oceans. I've kept them separate because I wanted you to grow up loving work more than what it buys. I wanted you to have a mother, not a portfolio." He was quiet for a full avenue. The city slid by in panes of light. "I loved the life we had," he said at last, "even when I thought it was small." "It was never small," I said, smiling into the glass. "It was narrow on purpose. Now I'm widening it." Upstairs, Walter held the elevator like he always did, the way some men hold a door for the truth. The penthouse opened like a held breath returned to the body. I watched Adrian's face as he entered my actual life. He didn't look at the view first, which is how I knew I had raised him right. He looked at the photographs, Diego holding him like a prophecy, a ribbon cutting where I stood 3 steps back from the big scissors, a university library wing with no name on it because anonymity had purchased more dignity than any plaque could have. "This is you," he said, "not a question, a recognition." "It's all me," I said, "and it's all yours if you want to know it." The screens blinked to life in my office. Arjun had lined up the models as neatly as a surgeon lays out instruments, and the world appeared in time zones across the wall. I took my seat. I watched my son take his. Ramon texted me that the Whitmores were on their way and that Bella had waved goodnight with a smile that didn't belong to Boston. I opened the call. The team in Tokyo bowed in little rectangles. We spoke Japanese, then English, then numbers. I insisted on language that would make the air cleaner in 15 years than it is tonight, and if I sounded like a woman who had grown tired of making riches the only religion anyone recognized, that's because I am. Adrian watched, and I watched him watching. His mind doing with policy what it has always done with stories, finding the human stakes and lifting them to the light. When the call ended, New York leaned its shoulder against the window like a tired dog. My son didn't speak for a moment. Then he moved toward the glass and laughed, a small, helpless sound that belonged to the boy who once believed a gaming console cost the world. "You speak better Japanese than my department chair," he said. "Don't tell him," I said. "He'll make me grade papers." He turned, serious now. "I forgive you," he said simply, "for the pretending. Because it wasn't pretending. It was staging, for me." I breathed. For the first time all day, I let it go all the way to the bottom. "Thank you." He pointed to a framed certificate tucked behind a plant I never water. "Is that a presidential medal?" "Technology and innovation," I said, and felt foolish and proud in the same breath, for something that saved a few banks from being very stupid in public. He shook his head as if he could realign 30 years in a single motion. "I have questions," he said. "Not tonight, but I have them." "Ask them all," I said. "Breakfast, lunch, dinner, every day until you're done. I will not lie again." The clock on the wall moved with an authority that owed nobody anything. 11:47. I texted Lorenzo a heart because language fails where food succeeds. I texted Bella a thank you for loving the boy I raised. I did not text Charlotte. Some conversions require silence. Adrian walked the perimeter of the room the way a reader walks the perimeter of a book he doesn't want to finish. When he reached the photo of Diego again, he touched the glass lightly. "He would have loved tonight," he said. "He would have made a speech," I said, and the thought made my throat go warm. "And cried, and claimed it was the wine." Adrian smiled with his father's mouth. It's not the wine. No, I said. It's the truth. He took my hand and squeezed once, the code for I'm here. On the other side of the window, the city kept doing its complicated dance. Traders asleep, bakers awake, taxis confessing their confessions to traffic lights. My son stood beside me in a home he'd never been allowed to call home, and for the first time since Diego died, I felt the scaffolding of my two lives creak and lower. The beams finding each other, the whole structure beginning to hold. Somewhere in Boston, a mother and father would be twisting their narrative into a new shape to make sense of a dinner that had taken away the mirrors and left only windows. Somewhere in Queens, Doña Lidia would be wrapping a cake for Sunday the way she always had, none of this changing the fact that her azúcar tasted like childhood. Somewhere in Tribeca, a chef would be closing his cellar and texting me a photograph of a cork with a smear of memory on it. I turned to Adrian. Tomorrow, I said, we'll go to Queens and then to the Hamptons, and I'll show you where we hid the pieces. No more compartments, just rooms. Okay, he said, not letting go of my hand. Tomorrow. For now, the night let itself be ordinary. We washed glasses that could have been washed by anybody. We stacked plates that didn't know who owned them. We set the coffee to brew and stood at the window in silence, two silhouettes against a city that had never been interested in anyone's secrets. When the machine hissed the way champagne hisses, I poured, and we raised mugs rather than flutes. To math married to hope, he said, because he had been listening. To dignity married to choice, I answered. We drank. We watched. We waited for morning, which is another word for mercy. The elevator doors slid open on a knife edge of silence, and the first thing I saw was the orchid, 3 feet tall, white as a confession, trembling in Charlotte Whitmore's hands like she didn't trust gravity. Behind her, Reginald gripped a bottle of Dom Perignon, as if it were a key that could unlock any door in New York. The wind off the Hudson shouldered through my terrace doors and fluttered the linen runner on the long table. Inside, the house smelled like sofrito and rosemary, and the citrus zest Lucia had sent over with Lorenzo's pastries. My Sunday circle was already here. Ethan and Lena Park clinking glasses by the piano, Gabriella Cruz arguing gently with Professor Arthur Levin about fiscal multipliers, Madeline Brooks, once Secretary of State, asking Walter about his granddaughter's recital, as if global briefings could make room for the soft news of a family. My son, Adrian, stood in the doorway to the kitchen, holding a knife the way Diego had taught him, 2 fingers pinching the spine, slicing shallots as if a life could be made precise by the thickness of a ring. Martina, Charlotte began, and caught herself, cheeks flushing into the mistake. Valeria. Welcome, I said, and the room shifted to make space for the people we would be teaching or forgiving. Maybe both. I took the orchid, set it in the corner where morning light was kind, and relieved Reginald of the dom with a smile that said not tonight. From the kitchen, the scent of a rose con pollo rose like a memory that had decided to keep us. Please, I said. Tonight we dress for comfort, not photographs. Charlotte glanced at her beadwork and then at my plain linen dress. Reginald's tie sat like a boast at his throat. Neither moved to adjust. Bella stepped in behind them with a small paper box tied in string from Doña Lidia's. The string was the same, faded red, her shop had used since I was a girl, with hands too eager for hot glass. Bella's eyes found mine, and gratitude passed between us like a clandestine gift. Adrian wiped his hands, set the knife down, and crossed the room. He hugged the Whitmores as if he'd been raised to hold out bridges even to people who had once tried to sell him a river. Hello, Mr. Whitmore, he said. Miss Whitmore. Charlotte, she corrected quickly. Reginald, please. Everyone uses first names at this table. It's the oldest rule we have. We made introductions that seemed to land like small earthquakes under Boston's shoes. Charlotte held herself very straight when she shook Madeline's hand, the way people do when they discover they've underestimated the scale of a room. Ethan's laugh rolled out of him like a sail catching wind. Lena's fingers brushed the piano keys and offered 3 notes that stitched the conversation into one fabric. Arthur mentioned a paper and then apologized for mentioning a paper, which made Gabriella roll her eyes and pour him more wine. Ramon arrived from the service elevator with 2 extra chairs, and Walter set them down as gently as if they were new beginnings. We brought something sweet, Bella said, holding out the box. Doña Lidia would fight me if I didn't serve her tarta de leche on a night like this, I said. You did good. She blushed, and Charlotte's mouth tightened at the sight of approval that belonged to no ledger she controlled. Adrian, I called toward the kitchen, because a boy's memory of a home is made in the clang and sizzle as much as it is in any view. Can you plate the greens? Lucia sent those sour oranges from Naples. Don't drown them, coax them. Yes, ma'am, he said, and his mock salute made Ethan grin. Do not underestimate the private languages a mother teaches a son. Sometimes a kitchen instruction is a benediction. We sat. We started with simple things, pan con tomate, the tomatoes cooked down until they stopped trying to prove themselves, olives brined to the edge of patience, a dish of thinly shaved fennel that could teach a person about restraint. Conversation moved like good service, seen, not flashy, there when needed and far away when it wasn't. The windows burned city gold and then slipped toward the blue that means New York is considering bed but only as a rumor. Somewhere across town, Lorenzo was closing the cellar. I could walk blind. He had texted me earlier. Your mother would say the saffron is talking tonight. I'd texted back a heart because language fails where food keeps its promises. Reginald cleared his throat, the way men do when they're about to rearrange a table to better accommodate their shape. Valeria, he began, and my name in his mouth sounded like he'd practiced it in the mirror. The story of Morales Financial Systems, Morales, MFS, it's extraordinary. We were unaware. He faltered and then put the sentence away, as if shame and strategy were quarreling for custody. I'd like to hear about those early days, he tried again. How you built this. I'd rather hear about Isabella's show, I said, and turned like a compass finds north. Curating is architecture. What are you building? Bella's relief was immediate and unguarded. We're opening with 7 emerging Latin American artists. I'm trying to push the board to let the wall text speak in 2 languages without apology. And to place the work from Oaxaca opposite the Boston School oils, so you can't miss the conversation between what was ignored and what was enshrined. Madeline leaned in. You'll get pushback, she said, the diplomat in her smoothing a napkin that didn't need smoothing. Give them the budget for the translation before they ask. Take away the excuse. I will, Bella said, and glanced at her mother, who looked as if someone had moved a familiar chair 2 inches to the left and refused to move it back. Translation as preemption, Arthur mused. Interesting. Translation as respect, Gabriella corrected. If you have to justify 2 languages in a city like this, maybe we should all go home. Charlotte lifted her glass and smiled in a way that negotiated between offense and grace. We absolutely support the arts, she said, which is a sentence that tries to do many jobs and ends up doing none well. Our foundation has long been. You'll like the second course, I said gently, because no one has to audition to eat here. My mother used to say cilantro demands company. She didn't tolerate monologues. The arroz con pollo arrived in a Dutch oven that had seen more Sundays than most marriages. Adrian set it down like an offering. The steam rose and curled into the chandeliers as if it carried names. When he started to serve, I watched his hands distribute thighs and wings without looking up, listening for who needed a leg and who would be grateful for rice shot through with bone-deep flavor. It's a kind of leadership, this quiet read of a room. Diego had it. Adrian has it. I wanted Charlotte to see it and understand that a person doesn't have to stand at a podium to rearrange the weather inside a house. We ate. We let forks talk for us. You'll have noticed by now that food is not a detail in my life. It is a syntax. When the pot was half empty, Reginald tried again. I owe you an apology, he said suddenly, and if there's one currency you can't counterfeit at my table, it's that one. He set his fork down and folded his hands, the way men do when they are asking not to be interrupted by their wives or their pride. At Bianchi's we evaluated what we thought we were seeing. We were wrong. I was wrong. Charlotte's chin lifted a degree. The city faded and the room concentrated around the space between her husband's admission and her silence. Adrian looked toward me, and my hand found his knee under the table, a small Morse code for let him open the door. He did. I appreciate that, I said simply. I don't need it, but I accept it. Charlotte exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath since Tribeca. She began, then stopped. I am very practiced at rooms where Presentation matters, she said finally. I mistook armor for a lack of worth. That is a sentence I don't like hearing myself say. Well, Lena said brightly, tonight's special is humility with a drizzle of relief. It made Charlotte laugh despite herself, which is often where real adjustments begin. Dessert waited in the kitchen like mercy. We cleared in the old way. No staff, just hands, because in the earliest version of this table we passed plates between fear and hope, and that rhythm never left us, even after the zeros multiplied. Bella carried the tarta. Adrian brought coffee. Ethan and Gabriella argued about whether MFS's ESG screen was too strict or not strict enough. Arthur tried to corner Madeleine about industrial policy until she told him, sweet as honey, to write the op-ed and stop lobbying at dessert. I took the terrace with my mug and found Reginald already outside, holding the rail the way men hold onto a problem. Hard and too late. The city scattered itself at our feet, a million windows practicing their own versions of truth. I thought money meant I knew things, he said without looking at me. It means you can afford mistakes other people survive only by luck, I said. That's different. He closed his eyes as if the wind stung. I spoke about Adrian's career as if public meant lesser. The irony is that the best education I ever got was from a public school teacher who saw I was drowning and taught me to swim across a sentence. There it is, I said softly. The sentence you've been avoiding. He nodded. Pride and performance are efficient. They keep a man from reconsidering the story that worked for him. He gestured toward the room. You built a story that worked for others. It also worked for me, I said. The trick of a life is building something that doesn't require someone else's diminishment to stand. He swallowed. May I ask you a question without offending? You can ask. I'll do the rest. Why keep Adrian in the smaller apartment? Why not tell him earlier and let him benefit? Because there are benefits to not knowing you can buy your way out. I said. He learned to stay in the room when it got uncomfortable. He learned to say no to the cheap version of yes. He learned the difference between cost and value. Those are skills worth more than a concierge. And the jet? The jet is a tool, I said, like a knife, like a scholarship, like a well-timed silence. I didn't want a tool to become a personality. He glanced back at the table where Charlotte was laughing with Lena about something trivial and saving, the way women do when they're building a bridge out of a quip. We're not accustomed to being the ones learning, he said. You're doing fine, I said. Eat the cake. Start there. When we came back inside, the tarta had begun to disappear at a rate that would have made Doña Lidia proud. Charlotte was asking Gabriella about how MFS structured sabbaticals for staff to serve in community roles. We cut pay by a percentage, Gabriella said, and we match that percentage with grants to the orgs they join. They bring back eyes we can't buy. Charlotte nodded in a way that suggested she was taking real notes rather than mental photographs. Ethan set his glass down and cleared his throat. He was only theatrical when he meant it. I'd like to make a toast, he said, rising slightly because some gestures insist on old-fashioned shape. To Valeria, who taught me to say no to beautiful nonsense. To Adrian, who keeps saying yes to work that matters. To Bella, who is about to place paintings where the light will tell the truth even if the labels refuse. To our hosts, the cooks and the laughter and the quiet moments in expensive rooms where nobody is trying to sell anything. And, he added, eyes glinting toward the Whitmores, to people learning out loud. Glasses lifted. Charlotte raised hers. To learning out loud, she repeated, and the room sealed the idea like a pact. Outside, a siren went by and reminded us the city doesn't toast back. The night's second act began with a knock at the door I hadn't been expecting. Walter intercepted it and turned to me with eyebrows that said both, I know, and you should. He opened the door to reveal a man with a reporter's face, handsome in a way that makes people want to confess and then complain. He held a portfolio, which is how you can tell a person hopes to be invited somewhere they shouldn't be, and he carried the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I'm sorry, he began, and wasn't. I'm looking for Ms. Morales. I sent an email, twice, no response. I'm with... Good night, I said and moved to close it. Wait, he said. It's not a profile, it's a correction. I let the door breathe another inch. Explain. On the ESG deal in Tokyo, your team's language is being framed as window dressing in a piece that will be published by morning. PR varnish was the phrase. I'm told it's untrue. I'm told your insistence on clean power requirements killed a rival bid 3 times larger. I would rather get it right than get you, Miss Morales. Behind me, conversations dimmed to a hum. I could feel Adrian's attention like warmth at my back. I studied the reporter's face for the thing I can't teach but recognize: intent. He had it. An old-fashioned kind. We invite doctors and preachers into our homes because they promise to tend to the body and the soul. Sometimes you let a journalist in because the truth is a room that needs more witnesses. 10 minutes, I said. On the terrace, no photographs, no names. You'll get documents after I redact vulnerable parties. If you burn me, I will end your career with a phone call and a PDF. Are we clear? He smiled, not offended, properly afraid. Yes, ma'am. Adrian was the first to follow me outside, then Bella, then, after a beat, Charlotte and Reginald, because proximity to integrity is a thing certain people suddenly crave when the wind changes direction. I laid it out, the clause that tied disbursement to pollution metrics, the rider that funded job training in affected towns, the sunset provision that guaranteed audits with teeth and public summaries, the term sheet language we had insisted on, and the language the rival had offered, cleaner on the surface and rotten underneath. The reporter's pen moved like a man trying to catch water with lines. Why do it? He said. You could have taken the larger bid and hidden behind good accounting. Because I like breathing, I said. Because I prefer a world where my son can take students outside and teach them to recognize a sky that isn't sick. Because money that multiplies at the expense of the air is a bad algorithm. Fix the code. He nodded. Fix the code, he repeated softly, as if that were a headline he might try to smuggle past an editor who liked blood more than policy. He closed his portfolio. I'll send pages. For fact-check. You'll send pages, I agreed. And you won't print until compliance confirms you're not endangering anyone. He left. The door clicked shut, and it sounded like an era deciding not to return. Charlotte was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her yet, respect without agenda. Reginald's shoulders had lowered by an inch, which is sometimes the only measurement you get. Why let him in? He asked. Because accuracy is a kind of mercy, I said. And I'm trying to practice more of both. Inside, the night shifted towards the kind of ease that only follows a hard conversation done right. Lena played a melody that wanted to be a lullaby and then changed its mind. Adrian brought out a framed photograph I hadn't visited in months, the 3 of us at the Hamptons' house, a kite yanking at the sky, Diego laughing into the wind. He set it in front of Charlotte, as if she were a student, and this was the day she would learn to read something new. We'll go there next weekend, he told me. If that's okay. It is, I said, and my voice surprised me by staying steady. At some point, the upstairs bathroom light failed and Ethan fixed it with a butter knife. At some later point, Arthur and Gabriella argued about whether impact had been so overused it no longer had impact, and Madeline laughed until she cried. Walter took a slice of tarta home for his wife because she liked breakfast sweet on Mondays. Ramon texted that the cars were ready when the Whitmores wanted them. The wind off the Hudson learned our names and used them to write notes on the glass. Ordinary magic. There is no better kind. When it was late enough that even the city began to consider sleep, the Whitmores stood to go. Charlotte took my hands in both of hers. Thank you, she said, the words shaped as if they had been sanded smooth in her mouth. For the food and the translation. Come back, I told her. Without orchids. She laughed, and this time, it wasn't a negotiation. Reginald shook Adrian's hand differently than a man shakes the hand of a suitor he is ranking. He shook it like a man greets a colleague whose syllabus he'd like to borrow. He hugged Bella and held on a moment too long, the way fathers do when they are recalibrating and need one more second of certainty that the ground will hold. After the door shut, the apartment exhaled. People drifted toward the terrace because ritual demanded the final 10 minutes under the stars. The city spread itself below, bridges with their necklaces of light, ferries shrugging across black water, windows telling their private little plays. We didn't speak. Everybody knows when the talking part is over and the listening part begins. Adrian took my hand. You widened it, he said, nodding toward the rooms as if they were a map. We widened it, I corrected. He looked at me and then past me, toward the empty chair we always leave between us when we tell the truth. Diego used to sit there, which is to say, he sits there still. He would have made a speech, Adrian said, and I smiled. He would have blamed the wine, I answered. Lie, Ethan called gently from the doorway. It would have been the onions. Laughter traveled across the terrace like a kind wind. When the last glass was washed and every guest had disappeared into the elevator with a piece of cake or a piece of advice, I stood alone for a moment and looked at the table we had set before history and appetite and expectation sat down at it together. The linen was creased and stained where olive oil had told the truth. The chairs were mismatched and perfectly matched. The orchid in the corner had decided to open a new bloom in the wrong season because the room was warm. And rules are for people who can't get comfortable otherwise. My phone, face down on the credenza, lit up with a message from Tokyo. Done. Language holds. I sent back a checkmark and a little green leaf because if you can't be proud in emojis, you might not be proud at all. Adrian padded back into the room, barefoot now, shirt untucked, the boy I raised, making room for the man who had forgiven me for wisdom delivered as secrecy. Drive to Queens in the morning, he said. Get coffee from the corner where the cups hurt your fingers? And empanadas, I said. Doña Lidia will try to give you 2 free ones. Don't let her. She's running a business. Okay, he said, and pulled me into a hug that was longer than the distance between who we had been and who we were learning to be. Okay. Tomorrow, I said into his shoulder, and felt something old lower itself down to rest inside my ribs. Tomorrow we'll go show the rooms to each other. And then we'll drive out to the Hamptons, and open the windows and let the sea ask us good questions. He nodded, and we'll answer some. Not all, I warned, smiling. Just enough to keep the conversation honest. The hum of the dishwasher replaced the hum of the city as we shut the terrace doors. 2 cups stood on the counter like obedient moons. He poured, I sugared, we clinked. In my head, Diego made the speech he always made, and we let him this time, because tonight the wine could take the credit and the onions could take the bow, and the rest of us could sit in the quiet and practice the particular American art of beginning again without pretending the before never happened. Near midnight, a draft of the reporter's article landed in my inbox. It was accurate, it was clean, it refused to flatter. It quoted the writer, it named the jobs. It explained why smaller is sometimes smarter and how a clause can be a lighthouse if you insist on it. I forwarded it to compliance with 3 redactions and a note. Hold his hand. I forwarded it to Adrian with 1 line. This is what a fix looks like before it's a headline. He replied with a thumbs up and then walked into my office to say it out loud because some messages belong to the air. We ended where we started, in the window. The river threw itself around our building like a ribbon, setting a gift. The city stretched, cracked its knuckles, and began again the way it always does, with the old stubborn hope that strangers in rooms will figure out how to say the truest possible thing to each other and live with the consequences. This is my favorite American habit, that we sit down with people who scare us and teach ourselves to be less certain and more brave. I turned off the last light. The apartment settled into its nocturne. Tomorrow would be Queens, and then the sea, and then the inevitable call with someone who believed money was a weather pattern that couldn't be moved. I would remind them it can. I'd remind myself that sometimes the only thing you need to move it is a table that welcomes the right argument and the cake that follows. Because sugar loosens tongues and forgiveness is easier when your mouth is sweet. "Mom," Adrian said, half asleep, voice low and light in the doorway to the guest room. "Yes?" "Thank you for the compartments," he said, "and for the rooms." "Thank you for walking across them," I said. He closed the door. The clock ticked toward a morning we had earned. I lay down for the first time in 30 years in a house where all my names were allowed to speak. If I dreamed, it was of chairs that found the right distance to make a circle, and a boy at a stove learning to salt generously but not carelessly, and a sky over Tokyo that was a little cleaner for being argued into honesty. The email hit at 9:03 a.m., subject line in a font that thought it was urgent. "We have a problem with your wall text." I was standing in front of Doña Lidia's counter in Queens, one hand around a paper cup too thin for the heat, the other hovering over a tray of empanadas I had no intention of resisting. The bell on the door chimed behind us as an MTA jacket brought in the weather. Adrian read over my shoulder. He'd shaved but missed one stubborn comma of stubble near his jaw. Diego used to leave the same punctuation and pretend it was intentional. "What wall text?" he asked, though he knew. He took a bite, burned his tongue, pretended he hadn't. "Bella's show," I said. "Bilingual labels. Someone's worried the words might be visible to the wrong kind of eyes." "Which kind is that?" Doña Lidia demanded from the friar, because she was constitutionally incapable of ignoring a problem within reach. "Illiterate?" I grinned in spite of the pulse escalating in my wrist. The donor committee wants to consider the optics of Spanish placed at equal weight. They're offering a compromise where English sits above and Spanish below, smaller, as if humility is a courtesy we owe only one language. "Tell them the alphabet doesn't do stairs," she said, and slid a second empanada into Adrian's bag without meeting my eye, because dignity, like generosity, should never require applause. Out on the sidewalk, Queens performed its favorite symphony. Trucks negotiating with double-parked sedans, the metallic prayer of a rolling gate, a conversation between two pigeons about territory. Adrian walked with the paper bag held like a relic. "They'll force it," he said. "They'll try," I said, and watched a grandmother drag a laundry cart like an anchor that still had work to do. I called Bella. Her voice was too bright, the pitch people use when the floor shifts and they refuse to let the plates fall. "It's fine," she said before I could open my mouth. "I'll fight it. If they pull funding, You'll keep your budget," I said, "even if I carry it on my back." "I can't let you." "You aren't," I said. "You're letting me return a favor to my 20-year-old self, who needed someone to tell her that clarity is not a temperament, it's a right." There was a pause. "My mother called this morning," she said. "She's on the committee for the donors' brunch at the Met next week. They've been talking." "About me or about Spanish?" I asked. "In their heads it's the same conversation," she said softly. She asked if I was certain I wanted to push this hard this fast. I told her the speed is only shocking if you've been standing in place for a long time. I pictured Charlotte at a table with linen like law, making notes with a pen that cost more than a month's rent at my first apartment. "Invite her to the install," I said. "Let her watch the walls go up." "She'll come?" Bella asked, skepticism and hope dueling under her breath. "She'll come to watch you," I said, "and to watch me watching you. That's progress, even if it arrives wearing the wrong shoes." We took the 7 train into Manhattan because Queens deserves its own pilgrimage. Adrian gripped the pole with 2 fingers, the way he holds a question he isn't sure belongs to him. At 10:27, as the city surged toward its midday, Ethan called to say the article had posted. "He made you sound like a stubborn saint and an accountant's worst nightmare," he said, pleased. "It's accurate. It's clean. It's going to make someone very rich and someone else very angry." "Accuracy is my preferred offense," I said. "Anger is a weather pattern. We own umbrellas." By the time we walked into Morales Gallery, the article had traveled further than a plane ticket. A junior curator with an undercut and a gaze like a welder's handed Bella her phone. "You're trending," she said, delighted by the weirdness of it. The main hall smelled like wet paint and anticipation. Wall sections leaned against sawhorses, a carpenter argued with a level that refused to lie. Crates sat like punctuation, periods, semicolons, an unexpected hyphen. Bella wore jeans and a black tee, and the kind of focused face that makes a man fall in love for the right reasons. She crossed the room and kissed Adrian, then tucked herself under my arm as if I were a scaffolding she trusted. "They're sending a representative from the donor circle," she said. 2 hours. "Perfect," I said. "We'll feed them." "You're weaponizing hospitality," Adrian murmured. "Always," I said. "Most battles are just dinner parties with better timing." At 12:03, Charlotte arrived with Reginald a half step behind. She had chosen clothes that suggested neutrality, camel and cream, which is a thing we do when we want to say I am not the problem. She took in the ladders, the crates, the artists who moved around their work with a tenderness I wish more people reserved for each other. "This is impressive," she said, and meant it, which I pocketed like a coin I might need later. She clocked the bilingual proofs on the floor, English and Spanish in the same size, left aligned, lines breaking where sense breaks rather than where English demands to be indulged. Her mouth did a small, complicated movement. She bent to read a paragraph, and then straightened as if the paper had bitten. "Spanish first?" she asked. "Depends on the piece," Bella said evenly. "Whose world the work was born in, the text follows the art, not the other way around." "The committee feels." "The committee doesn't feel," I said gently. "It positions." "That's unfair," Reginald said, bristling more to protect his wife than the committee. "These are good people." "I know," I said. "I've been one of them." A woman in a silk scarf and a smile designed to erase dissent approached with a clipboard. She introduced herself as vice chair and said she lived in a building that had never allowed a mistake. "We're excited," she began, and I counted 3 too many commas before the conjunction. "We just want to ensure the labels are legible for our patrons, many of whom are." "Old?" Bella supplied. She laughed as if that had been the joke she intended. "Accustomed to a certain order. We're proposing a compromise, English above, Spanish below, slightly smaller. Our patrons don't so much read as glance, and we want their glance to land where they expect it." "Patrons can be taught," I said. "You taught them to expect their names on walls. You can teach them to expect respect." Her smile sharpened. "We underwrite exhibitions. Respect cuts both ways." "Then show up to the work," I said. "Don't ask the work to show up to your habits." Charlotte's breath made a small sound in her throat that might have been a warning or admiration. Reginald examined a crate and pretended this wasn't his lane. The room waited. The artists, the installers, my son, who has built a job out of asking people to inhabit sentences they didn't know belonged to them. The vice chair turned to Bella. "You're very young to insist." "That's why I'm young," Bella said, "to insist while there's still time." "We could pull a portion of our support," the vice chair said, no longer smiling. "You could," I said. "And we will hang the show anyway. Your patrons will come for the work because it's undeniable. We will publish an acknowledgement that says, funding adjusted due to the equal treatment of languages. Then we will see what sort of patrons prefer inequity in print." Silk Scarf looked at me as if I had lifted a table with one hand. "That would be unkind." "That would be accurate," I said. "Trust me, accuracy reads as kindness later." She glanced at Charlotte, seeking a familiar face in an unfamiliar room. Charlotte inhaled, exhaled, chose, and stepped into the air above the net. "I've been on enough committees to know we sometimes mistake our comfort for best practice," she said. Her voice found a lower octave I hadn't heard from her. "Isabella, I don't understand every choice you make, and I don't intend to pretend I do. But I'm learning the world is larger than the rooms I memorized. The labels stay. I'll speak to the circle." Bella looked like someone had moved the sun closer. Reginald blinked, recalculated, and put an arm around his wife with the lightest touch, the exact weight support should be when a woman changes her mind in public. Silk Scarf frowned and softened a fraction. "You'll have to find the money elsewhere," she said. "We can't." "I can," I said. "On the condition that your circle agrees to a change in governance at the next cycle, 2 community seats with votes, not ribbons. You want my money, you get my math." She stared at me as if she had opened a closet and found a wolf in a tuxedo. Then she measured the room, the artists watching, the installers waiting, the camera phones that could become headlines. She wasn't a villain. She was a student in a class she hadn't meant to enroll in. "We'll discuss," she said. "For now, proceed." Bella closed her eyes for half a second, and then opened them onto the work like a conductor lifts her hands. "Let's hang room 1, she called, and the gallery transformed from argument into architecture. People moved, walls rose, light adjusted, Spanish and English found each other on paper and made a marriage that didn't ask who was more important. Charlotte drifted to the corner where a painter was uncrating a canvas that smelled like earth and electricity. She asked a question with genuine curiosity and then listened to the answer. Which is how you learn, even after the part of life where you think you already know most things. At 2:41, my phone vibrated with Arjun's ringtone, the one that says, "Choose your next sentence carefully." "Tokyo's rival bid is back," he said. They're offering more money and letting the dirty power clause masquerade as mixed fuel options. Local press is lauding them as pragmatic. Your call? We don't take more money to buy a worse future, I said. Write a letter we expect to leak. Numbers in the first paragraph. Air in the second. Jobs in the third. Audit in the fourth. Release it after they release theirs. Don't be first, be correct. You're trending, Arjun said, as if my social velocity were now part of risk management. The board wants to know if your spine is a line item. It is, I said. Call it fixed asset. He laughed, blessedly. Copy. At 3:12, a student of Adrian's appeared at the door as if he had been called by the same weather we were all feeling. He was first gen, hair braided tight, backpack thudding with books. He looked at Adrian like a person looks at a shoreline after a storm. Professor, he said, and swallowed. They posted your name on some blog. Nepotism, baby. That you got your fellowship because your mom is. He gestured vaguely toward me with eyes that wanted to be brave and still be kind. Because my mother is very good at math, Adrian said calmly, and because I am very good at the thing I do. Both made the funding possible. Neither wrote a single paragraph for me. He put a hand on the student's shoulder. Stay in the room when they try to make you smaller. That's not advice. That's a survival trick. The boy nodded, a small, fierce move, and turned to me. Ma'am, he said, awkwardly formal, my mother cleans offices in Midtown. She says to tell you she likes the clause about training. She says if they're going to close one thing, they should open another. Tell her she understands economics better than most economists, I said. Tell her she's right. He smiled, shy and proud at once. She is. He left with a look back at the wall where his city now had two languages telling it the truth. By 6, the first room was up. The labels read like clear water. Reginald carried a hammer for exactly 60 seconds, and discovered he preferred offering to hold the ladder while someone braver climbed. Charlotte sat on a packing crate and took off her shoes because her feet hurt, and she had decided the room didn't care what she wore if she was listening properly. Bella moved from artist to artist like a midwife. Adrian manhandled a vitrine with Arthur and then argued on the phone with a dean who thought he could tempt him away to a private college with a salary that tasted like honey and handcuffs. What did you tell him? I asked when he hung up. That the work isn't a ransom note, he said. That I'd prefer the salary that keeps my mouth honest. Did he understand? He understood enough to be annoyed, Adrian said. That's a start. At 7:30, I sent everyone home who didn't live on coffee and adrenaline. The gallery belonged to the crew that thrives when clocks panic. Ramon arrived with sandwiches. Enzo sent over a crate of blood oranges and a text that said, Lucia insists you eat something that remembers it was a tree. We ate standing up, which is the position favored by people who want to be ready when the next thing demands to be lifted. At 9, a storm walked in from the river and pounded the roof until the gallery's bones sang. The power flickered once in a theatrical gesture, and then thought better of it. I checked my inbox. A note from compliance, 3 green checks, a curt email from the vice chair. We will trial your governance proposal for 1 year. The word trial made me smile. Trials are how systems confess what they're built to do. At 10:15, Charlotte returned from a call with Boston, hair pulled back, face thinking. They're upset, she said. They think I've abandoned the circle. You're redrawing it, I said. Circles can be redrawn. She looked at Bella across the room at my son at the bilingual paper drying on racks. I thought money could make rooms kinder, she said. I'm realizing it just makes them louder unless someone asks a better question. Ask this one, I said. Who does the room serve? And who would it rather be seen serving? She nodded like a woman filing a new doctrine under her ribs. I'm staying tonight, she said. If you'll have me, I can hold a level, I can take notes, I can learn where to stand. You can eat, I said, handing her half a sandwich because theology is easier with mustard. We worked. Midnight arrived and then pretended to leave. The storm held court and then softened. The gallery took shape, angles turning into intention, echoes into acoustics. At 1:13, Ethan showed up with Lena and a toolbox because he had remembered my text about a stubborn hinge and decided that venture capital sometimes involves screws. Madeline arrived with thermoses and a story about a vote that had turned on a comma. Gabriella crawled under the lighting grid like a mechanic blessed with policy degrees. Walter dropped off fresh towels in the bathroom without making a sound. This is how things stand up. People who have no business being there decide to be there anyway. At 2:04, the reporter texted a photo of the front page where the ESG clause had made print, alongside a smaller grudging correction in the rival's piece. He'd circled the word teeth in the audit paragraph. I wrote back, "Accuracy is a kind of mercy, remember?" He wrote, "I'm learning." At 3:17, I sat on the floor with Adrian, backs against a wall that still wore painter's tape, and let the loud quiet land. The kind where everyone you love is busy near you and nothing is required but presence. "Tomorrow," he said, as if tomorrow were a good dog that would sit if called gently enough. "Opening at 6, I said. "Donors at 5, reporters at 7, your students at 8. People who wander in because the door is open at 9. And the Whitmores? First in line," I said. "They're learning to be early to their daughter's life." He tipped his head back against the wall and closed his eyes, the exact posture Diego used to take when he'd claim to be thinking and then fall asleep mid-claim. "I keep expecting a part of me to hate this," he said, "the largeness, the attention. But it feels like when I find the right paragraph and everything else shifts to make room. Not louder, clearer." "You inherited your father's suspicion of spectacle," I said, "and my addiction to clarity. We'll manage." At a little before 5, the sky cracked open into a dawn that looked like an apology for the storm. We had done it. The show hung, the labels dry, the floor mopped, the air holding a charge that wasn't entirely electricity. I went to the bathroom, washed paint from my hands until my palms remembered they were mine, and returned to find Charlotte standing alone in front of the first piece, a small canvas where a woman's hands cupped water that reflected a sky written in both tongues. "She taught me the alphabet doesn't do stairs," Charlotte said without looking at me. "Who did?" I asked, though I already knew. "Your baker," she said, "which is to say, the city." We stood there together, two women who had learned to breathe in different rooms, trying to find a rhythm that didn't require one of us to go quiet. She slipped her shoes back on and squared her shoulders like a person showing up for her own life. The first patrons arrived smelling like rain and confidence. They read the labels and didn't die. Some frowned in the direction of habit, others smiled because the world had been translated into something that included them, without pretending they were the only ones worth including. Reginald took a program and put on readers he pretended he didn't need. Ethan introduced himself to strangers as if he had all the time in the world. Lena played a little on the gallery's old upright, and the notes chose to be generous. Gabriella stood near the door like a bouncer who only blocks toxicity. Arthur hovered near the donor circle and tried to look harmless, which to his credit he often is. At 6:07, a young woman in a thrifted jacket stood in front of a piece and cried in a way that made the room step back and give her what she needed. Bella approached and asked nothing, just stood beside her until the woman put her hand to her mouth and laughed at herself for crying, and then cried harder, because now it was safe. Charlotte watched and didn't fix it. That felt like a new architecture, too. The vice chair approached me near the end with a face that had gone through 3 drafts of itself since noon. "We'll bring your governance proposal to a vote," she said. "We might even pass it." "Let the work do the persuading," I said. "It's better at it than I am." "You're very good at it," she said grudgingly, then smiled, a real one. "Annoyingly so." "Occupational hazard," I said. When the lights cooled and the last patron drifted into the night, we stood in the afterglow, the way a gallery feels when it has said something it needed to say and can finally drink water. Bella leaned her head on Adrian's shoulder and closed her eyes. Charlotte put her hand on the small of her daughter's back and didn't move it. A small claim, a small promise. Reginald looked at me and without words said thank you for the room. We didn't go to the Hamptons that night. We went home and slept like people who had carried a wall together. The ocean could wait. Queens would be there in the morning with coffee that burns and hands that know better than committees what language is for. Tokyo would call with numbers that wanted to dress up as ethics, and we would insist they show us their birth certificates. My son would teach his class and then come by the gallery with a group of students who believed they could interrogate the world into decency. I woke before the city and stood in my kitchen, listening to a silence that had work to do. The orchid from Charlotte opened another bloom because the room was warm and rules are only useful when they make more room for love. I brewed coffee and texted Lorenzo a photo of the bilingual label over the first piece. He sent back a string of hearts and a photo of Lucia pointing at a pot and bossing him like a general. Ethan texted, "Board meeting went your way, mostly." Arjun texted, "Language holds, fixed asset noted." The reporter texted a link, "Correction above the fold." And Adrian wandered out in bare feet, hair disobedient, eyes kind, and said, "Mom, what's for breakfast?" "Whatever the alphabet wants," I said and handed him a plate. "We're practicing fluency." The invitation said black tie, but the air in the ballroom felt like a secret rehearsal. 1,000 watts of politeness rattling against something true that wanted out. Chandeliers threw disciplined constellations across the ceiling. An orchestra practiced the kind of restraint power likes to dance to. James Chen stood near the stage, hair a little more salt than last year, eyes bright with mischief and endings. Retirement dinners rarely tell the whole story. They're better at pretending. Tonight would have to do both. "Val," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like ink and ambition. "You ready to say the thing you always say when you think people need to remember oxygen?" "I'm going to talk about code and consequences," I said, which is another way to say breath. "Good," he said. "If they all try to applaud at the wrong places, give them a look." "I have several," I said. He grinned, then tilted his head toward the far doors, where the room had just learned to hold its breath. The president entered without trumpets, flanked by the usual choreography of stillness disguised as motion. He made a point of greeting the waitstaff before the donors, which is a sentence I will always enjoy writing. When his eyes found ours, his smile traveled like a messenger. He shook James's hand, hugged Lena as if music were an old friend, and squeezed my shoulder like we'd survived something together, which we had, several somethings. "Save me from my own speech," he murmured. "Make yours the one they remember." "I'll try," I said. "You do the handshakes." He chuckled, then glanced toward the back where Charlotte and Reginald stood with a cluster of Boston money, looking as if they'd discovered satire was a mirror. Charlotte had chosen a navy dress that didn't argue. Reginald's tuxedo fit like a theory. Bella and Adrian arrived behind them, late on purpose, laughing at something small and private, the way people do when they know the room can wait its turn. The program began. There were videos and modestly immodest anecdotes. Ethan told a story about James backing a company whose only asset was a stubborn woman who learned to say no in 2 languages. Arthur went on too long and was saved by Lena's piano sliding beneath his words like mercy. Madeline introduced the president with a sentence so clean it should have been framed. He returned the kindness by talking not about James's exits but about his entrances. The rooms he changed by showing up when it was most inconvenient. When it was my turn, I didn't look at the teleprompter. Words behave better when they know you mean them. I talked about infrastructure the way you talk about the body. Nerves that carry information, muscles that do the lifting, skin that holds us together. I said algorithms are laws that haven't been elected yet. I said money is a tool that keeps mistaking itself for a personality, and that we had written code that refused to pay for a future that coughed. I said James had the rare habit of asking, who else needs to be in this room before he decided what chair to sit in. At the second applause line, I did not give them a look. I let them have it. At the third, I raised a hand and they stopped because authority feels like kindness when it's used to protect the next sentence. I told a story I hadn't planned to tell. Diego at a whiteboard in a garage that leaked, explaining to me that time is the only honest investor because it insists on due diligence. I didn't cry. The room did the respectful shift we all do when grief walks through politely and refuses to take over the party. I ended with a line that made the president laugh out loud and then swallow it like a man protecting an asset. Fix the code, pass the audit, and leave the door open. When I left the stage, the noise was the right temperature. James whispered, "You obnoxiously perfect person," which is his way of saying nailed it. The president squeezed my elbow and said I needed that sentence, which meant he'd quote it later and pretend it was mine and his. That's the choreography. We know it, we forgive it. On the far side of the room, Charlotte was crying without ruining her face. Reginald seemed confused about whether to comfort or take notes. Bella took her mother's hand and didn't let go. Adrian mouthed wow in a way that made me feel 27 and terrified and more certain than the chairs. I didn't make it halfway to them before Arjun appeared at my shoulder with the face people wear when they'd rather not ruin your night. High alert, he said simply. We're seeing probing on the Singapore edge. It looks like an intelligence-grade recon, not ransomware, not smash and grab. They're studying us. Pivot the traffic to the sandbox, burn the mirrors, and let them believe they've found a back door, I said. I want signatures, not smoke. Call Gabriella and wake the crisis tree. Don't ruin the soup, we just need to salt it. He nodded, thumb already moving. If this is state-backed, we'll need politics. I just talked to politics, I said. We can be polite. Arjun vanished into the potted ficuses the way good people disappear when the work doesn't require applause. I took a breath so deep it scratched something on the way down, then found my way to my son. That was surgical, Adrian said, and kissed my cheek. My students are going to think I'm lying when I tell them I know you. Make them a better story, I said, and tell them to read the corrections tomorrow. Bella hugged me hard. My mother said, fix the code, pass the audit into her champagne like it was a Hail Mary. Did she say leave the door open? I asked. Not yet, Bella said, but she stood in front of a painting for 4 minutes and didn't check her phone. That's a kind of door. Charlotte stepped forward, eyes human in a way I hadn't seen the first night. I don't know how to apologize without sounding like I'm applying for something, she said. So I'll say it plain. I was wrong. You were patient. I am trying to be new in rooms that were built for my old self. Welcome, I said. We keep the windows open. Reginald extended his hand. I took it. I have an idea for a joint fund, he said, and I tensed for the pitch, but his next sentence surprised me. Anonymous grants for bilingual education infrastructure, libraries, not plaques. We can pilot in Boston and Queens. I smiled because the universe has a sense of humor. We'll call it the Alphabet Fund, I said, and the alphabet doesn't do stairs. He startled, then laughed. Deal. We ate food that no one remembers and smiled for photographs that will become a headline someone else will assume tells the story. The president left with a wave that made 2 servers blush. James danced with Lena in a way that would make the internet declare itself alive again. Madeline pretended to be scandalized by Arthur's opinions on commas. Ethan tried to convince Gabriella to take 2 weeks off and failed. Afterward, we spilled into the hotel bar where sincerity has to fight harder than liquor. Ramon texted that the car was arranged. Walter texted that the orchid had opened another bloom. Arjun texted one word, hooked. I excused myself from a circle of politicians playing the game where you say, great to see you, and mean, I needed to be seen, and ducked into a quiet that smelled like carpet and donations. We've got them in a sandbox, Arjun said when I called. 3 nodes, 2 playbooks. They're tasting our auth APIs with a patience I haven't seen outside of, I know, I said. Route them to the decoy treasury and let them download a rabbit they will never catch. While they chase, we wash the teeth. Bored? After I tuck my son in, I said. Give me an hour. You look like you might finally sleep, he said. You sound like you won't. Both can be true, I said, and hung up before he could be kind. Back at the table, Adrian was in conversation with someone whose lapel pin gave me hives. He handled the exchange with the grace of a person who knows he doesn't have to win to keep his soul. Bella watched him with a pride that didn't require him to perform. Charlotte and Reginald were telling Ethan they liked his tie because admitting they liked his mind would require a larger renovation. I touched Adrian's shoulder. I need to head to the office, I said. Do you want to? Yes, he said before I finished, then looked at Bella. I'll come, she said. I want to see how a rabbit is chased. Charlotte stiffened like a reflex. At this hour? She said, then caught herself. No, yes. Go. This is your world. It's our world, Bella corrected, and for once, Charlotte didn't strain against the grammar. The city at midnight feels like a deal you make with the future. If I keep moving, morning will owe me. The elevator opened on my office with its slow sigh of wealth behaving itself for a minute. The screens were already lit, a constellation of red that meant not yet, not yet, not yet. Arjun stood with his tie askew like a flag after weather. Gabriella had her hair in a knot that said war. 3 engineers I trust more than my own coffee machine worked like surgeons, which is to say, nobody raised their voice and everyone told the truth. We watched the adversary map itself in real time, elegant and hungry. They took what we offered, credentials with a bite hidden in the sugar, endpoints that looked like silk and also like teeth. We gave them feeling without skeleton. They chased ghosts into a museum of mirrors and congratulated themselves on their reflections. Whoever they are, Gabriella murmured, they've read our documentation with a poet's attention. Then let's give them a poem that ends in a lighthouse, I said. We pivoted traffic, salted logs, fed the machine the data it needed to become smarter on our behalf. We made coffee that tasted like good intentions. Adrian stood at the back, absorbing, not asking for translation because the work doesn't wait for your captions. Bella moved between screens, more interested in the faces than the graphs, watching how people hold themselves when the floor between now and disaster is a spreadsheet. Arjun pointed to a signature circling our decoy treasury, like a shark testing acrylic. That has the shape of a state, he said. We don't say the name, I said. We buy the time. We call the people who move quietly. Madeline? Gabriella asked. She's already moving, I said. Politics looks slow because the cameras are heavy. Under the table, the legs are sprinting. At 2 a.m., the adversary took the bait we'd laid hours earlier, a breadcrumb glinting like a stupid jewel. They pivoted into a tunnel that had no floor and discovered they could fall without end. We watched the packet spin and smiled. Small, sober smiles. Arjun exhaled. They'll try another door, he said. But not tonight. Good, I said. I'd like to sleep like a person. Adrian touched the edge of my desk and looked around at the room he was only now letting into his imagination. This is church, he said softly. This is plumbing, I said. But your father would have liked the metaphor. He would have made a speech, Adrian said, and we were both surprised by how easy the laughter came. When the immediate crisis was contained, I sent everyone home who had families to go to and couches that knew their shape. Arjun and Gabriella stayed because some people are married to the work in a way that doesn't make them less human. Bella curled up on the sofa with a blanket. I'm not sure how offices acquire, and closed her eyes and didn't sleep. Adrian dozed in the chair with the ugly arms he claims are honest. I stood at the window and let the city teach me humility with its lights. At 5, compliance sent the all-clear on the reporter's follow-up. At 6, the president's chief of staff texted a thank you for the sentence he'd borrowed, followed by a question about the adversary that we'd both pretend was hypothetical. At 7, Doña Lidia sent a picture of a tray of empanadas and the caption, for warriors and children who wake up before they have to. At 8, Ramon texted, car is downstairs. At 9, the gallery opened to a line that looked like a parade deciding to be good. The day blurred into a montage. Meetings that felt like small meals, calls that tasted like weather. The Alphabet Fund became a document, moving through signatures like a river moves through a canyon. Queens hummed. Boston blinked. Tokyo slept and dreamed of clean power and audit teeth. I found minutes to watch footage of the gallery on the local news. A grandmother reading the label in Spanish first, and then in English, smiling at the order she chose. A teenager explaining to his boyfriend why a frame is also a statement. Charlotte on camera saying we're learning to read without asking the words to bow. Progress in HD is still progress. By late afternoon, I crashed, which for me means I stopped pretending I could hold the entire agenda in my mouth and let the edges go fuzzy. I texted Lorenzo 3 words, Hamptons tonight? He replied with a string of pasta emojis that resolved into yes. I sent the same to Adrian. He wrote back, Bella says bring sandwiches, not speeches. I said, noted. The drive out is always a confession. The city shrugs off its coat and shows you the skin beneath. Adrian drove because he needed to perform a function other than thinking. Bella curated a playlist that respected both Spanish and Springsteen. The highway wrote its long lines for us. The sky considered rain and then decided not to. The house waited the way houses do when they are old enough to remember who you were, before you learn to win. We walked through rooms that had stayed the same on purpose. Diego's sweater on the hook like a laugh, a bookshelf that refuses to alphabetize because meaning behaves differently than order, a table we bought at a yard sale where a child once sold lemonade that tasted more like persistence than lemons. I opened windows. The sea walked in and set its bag down and asked for a chair. On the back porch, the three of us ate sandwiches that had no idea they were participating in a ritual. Adrian held the letter I had written years ago, the one sealed in an envelope with his name and 35 like a promise and a threat. He rested it on his knee and sized it up. "I thought I'd be angry," he said. "I'm not." "You can be later," I said. "Anger takes its time." He sighed, laughed, shook his head at the ocean. "I get it," he said. "The compartments, the rooms, the math about what gets built first." He looked at Bella, then back at me. "I want access to the trust with conditions I set." "Tell me," I said, and felt Diego pull up a chair. "1," he said, holding up a finger like a boy explaining new rules. "I never want to know the total, just the cadence. 2, disbursements tied to my public teaching load. If it dips below what keeps me honest, the money gets bored and leaves. 3, a tithe to the alphabet fund every year, indexed to whatever you're indexing it to, plus a spicy multiplier for years I get promoted so I don't start loving titles more than kids. 4, a clause that says if I ever use money to leave a room that needs me, the trust has permission to laugh and shut off." I stared at him because he was inventing a language I understood with my whole body. "Done," I said, and meant it. 5, he grinned. 5, you are obligated to say no to me at least once a year, even if I'm right. "I can do that," I said. "I've been training." Bella wiped her eyes with a wrist like she was pretending the salt air was the problem. "I want in," she said. "Not to the money, to the rules. I want a clause of my own." "Name it," I said, knowing already I'd say yes. "If my work starts to choose rooms over people," she said, "you are required to invite me to dinner in Queens and seat me next to someone who can't pronounce my last name on the first try." "Done," I said again. "We'll put it in ink." We spent the kind of evening that never makes it into biographies because nobody mistakes it for an accomplishment. The ocean changed its mind 3 times. A gull advocated loudly for theft. We practiced deadlines on shell skipping. I told a terrible joke about auditors that made Adrian groan and Bella snort. We washed plates. We didn't fight with time. Near dark, a storm marched across the horizon like theater. We let it pass without giving it a name. My phone stayed face down on the table until it didn't, until Arjun texted one word I'd been waiting for. Withdrawn. The adversary had packed up its mirrors and left. The sandbox was empty except for our footprints. I allowed myself the small luxury of imagining a world where staying becomes an advertisement, where people brag about not leaving, where bilingual labels are so normal they become invisible again, where algorithms grow up to be laws and laws grow up to deserve them, where my son teaches his students to distrust applause and Bella hangs a show in a town that doesn't understand why it's crying and cries anyway, where Charlotte sits in a meeting and says we can redraw this circle, where Reginald writes a check and doesn't put his name on it and sleeps better than he has since he was 12. We went to bed in rooms that remembered us. The ocean kept its own counsel. The house exhaled like a choir whose last note finally found its home. In the morning, Adrian made coffee that didn't embarrass our bloodline. Bella went for a run and came back with sand glued to the back of her ankles like punctuation. I took a call on the porch with the president's chief of staff where we discussed nothing and meant everything. And then I hung up and didn't tell anyone because secrets aren't always about power. Sometimes they're about protecting the silence required to keep a thing in one piece. At noon, we drove back to the city because New York grows fidgety if you ignore it. We stopped in Queens, where Doña Lidia gave us 2 empanadas we paid for, and one she insisted was a loan. We stood under the awning, grease bleeding through paper, and watched a wedding party spill out of a storefront church in a gust of rice and grammar. The groom tripped, laughed, bowed, stood. The bride lifted her dress and ran like a victory lap. The photographer shouted instructions in Spanish, and then in English, then in laughter, which is the 3rd language of this city. Back at the gallery, the line was longer than yesterday. The labels had not hurt anyone. A child read both paragraphs out loud, tripping only once on a word that shouldn't have been so heavy and wasn't anymore. The vice chair nodded at me the way people do when they're learning to be happy about being wrong. Charlotte hugged a docent, which should be a lyric in a national anthem. Reginald declined an interview politely and meant it. Ethan got into an argument with a teenager and lost. It made his week. At my office, Arjun slept for the first time in 26 hours while a dashboard watched on his behalf. Gabriella put her head on the conference table for a full minute and called it meditation. Arthur sent me a paper I promised to read and didn't yet. Madeline forwarded an email thread with 4 things I needed to see and 1 joke that saved me. We ended the week the way we always do when we're lucky, with a table. Queens on Sunday, the penthouse the next, the Hamptons when the weather forgives us. This time, Charlotte and Reginald came to Queens without flowers. Charlotte brought Tupperware. Reginald brought a story about a teacher who'd once saved him with a sentence. Bella brought her mother's hand to the slicer and said, "This is how thin," and Charlotte nodded and learned. Adrian brought a letter with the rules we'd made for the money, and I signed it like a mother and a trustee, and a woman who'd finally stopped pretending that love and governance are different subjects. After dinner, we walked to the corner where coffee costs less than a conversation, and watched as a boy on a bike balanced a cake box one-handed and didn't drop it. An old man argued with a pigeon because someone has to tell the birds the truth. A bus breathed in and then exhaled people with stories we won't hear and will still be shaped by. The alphabet did what it always does when you treat it right. It made room for more names. On the way back, a reporter recognized me and did not stop me because he had learned something about doors. A woman tapped my sleeve and said, "Auditoria con dientes," with a grin. I will hold on dark days. A kid in a hoodie asked Adrian if literature could make him less angry, and Adrian said, "It can make you angry at the right things," which is what I wish I'd told myself when I was 17 and moving to Cambridge with a suitcase and a superstition. At the apartment, Walter told me the orchid had opened 2 more blooms, which should not be possible, and therefore is. We sat on the terrace. The city did its light trick. Diego made his speech in my head, and we clinked to it because some ghosts deserve a toast. We were, all of us, a little tired and a little braver. The code was holding, the audit was scheduled, the door was open. The paint wasn't even dry on the last caption when the first threat slid into Bella's inbox like a bad idea pretending to be a warning. "Take your Spanish off our walls." It came in all caps with the bravado of someone who has never had to back up an argument without volume. She didn't forward it to me. She walked across the gallery floor with her phone in her palm and a look that told me she would not be learning fear on the job. Outside, New York acted like it had an alibi. Sirens going somewhere else, steam behaving itself as it rose from the street. We had exactly 19 minutes before doors opened for the Friday night program. Student musicians, a poet who wrote in 2 languages without asking permission, docents who had practiced the art of pointing at a painting and then pointing back at the person looking. Charlotte stood at the welcome desk with a name tag she had insisted on wearing because it kept her honest. Reginald carried programs the way men carry new babies, careful, a little awed, already protective. Adrian met my eyes from across the room, felt the temperature change, and came to stand with us. "Delete it," Bella asked. "No," I said. "Archive and screenshot. Then text the precinct liaison, and forward to the reporter who got the clause story right. Accuracy grows better in the sun." "Copy," she said, and her mouth did not so much harden as decide. At 6:03, 3 boys in fitted caps and nervous swagger pushed through the door and did that thing kids do when a space seems like it might tell on them. Made themselves bigger by pretending they were bored. One held a black marker like a dare. They beelined for the first label and made a show of not reading it. The tallest glanced over his shoulder, caught Adrian's professor face, and rolled his eyes with less conviction than he wanted. The marker unsheathed with a sound like a small sword. "Stop," Bella said, her voice a chord. She did not step back. She did not touch. She stood beside the label as if the wall had hired her to be its lawyer. Charlotte walked around the desk faster than her shoes wanted. A hand up, not scolding, blocking. "Not here," she said. And to my own surprise, I heard nothing performative in it. The tallest boy froze at the sound of a mother who had stopped practicing other people's rules. Something in him recognized something in her. A match. His friend snorted to keep his pride upright. The third boy, youngest by a country mile, stared at the painting and then at the letters as if they were asking a question he didn't know he knew the answer to. "Do you even speak it?" the tallest said, chin at a stubborn angle, meaning Spanish and also meaning respect and also meaning in the language of a city that teaches you to hide your hunger, love. "Sí," Charlotte said, without a Cambridge accent. "Un poco, suficiente para escuchar." Enough to listen. He blinked. A beat. The marker hung midair, undecided. Adrian stepped in, not as police, not as principal, but as an invitation. "You want to read the first line?" he asked the youngest. "English or Spanish? Your call. If you mess up, I'll mess up with you." The boy laughed despite himself and read, stumbling over a poem word that was supposed to be heavy and suddenly wasn't. When he finished, the room breathed. The marker lowered. Bella nodded once, almost imperceptible, as if she were stamping a visa. "You can stay," she told them. "If you stay, you help. We need chairs moved at 7. Deal?" They shrugged, like they weren't going to tell their friends this story with their hands later. They stayed. The threat went out like a match in rain, and something else took its place. The night worked. The poet read a line about a grandmother's kitchen that made the whole room taste like cilantro. The student quartet played a piece they'd been told wasn't pretty until they made it so. A man with a suit more expensive than his vocabulary asked Charlotte if the Spanish was permanent. "The respect is," she said, and when he tried to laugh it off, she didn't. Halfway through the evening, the precinct liaison arrived in plain clothes, nodded at Bella, and took a quiet tour that meant the gallery would not be alone even when it was. The reporter texted that he'd post a small piece about the email, not to amplify, but to frame it. Backlash as proof the change was landing where it needed to. We closed past 10. The boys returned the chairs to the exact original positions because some lessons you learn once and keep. The youngest folded programs into airplanes, and when he thought no one was watching, he read the label a second time, slower, to himself. Charlotte handed the tallest boy the marker without comment. He looked at it as if it were suddenly a responsibility and put it in his pocket like a secret that had better behave. That weekend, the opening turned into a week, and the week insisted on being a conversation. People argued without breaking. People cried and then apologized for crying and then didn't. 2 donors withdrew politely, 3 new ones appeared with checks that didn't ask for their names to be printed. Reginald sent over the draft for the Alphabet Fund, with a subject line that didn't swagger. "What if we start with libraries?" I sent back a correction to a preposition and a yes. On Tuesday, the invitation to testify arrived. A Senate subcommittee on digital markets and infrastructure wanted me on Thursday morning to talk about critical systems and the circling adversary nobody would name out loud on C-SPAN. The email was polite in the way power is when it is sure of itself. I recognized the chair from a dinner where men had mistaken my silence for an empty room. The ranking member would be 10 minutes of grandstanding, followed by a request for a photograph. We would give him the photograph and nothing else. "Do you want company?" Adrian asked, reading my face. "Always," I said. "Bring a book to grade. Bring your patience. Bring your decent shoes. Marble is a liar." Bella had the install that morning. She kissed my cheek and said, "Don't let them talk about fear like it's a budget." Charlotte asked if she should watch live or wait for the highlight reel. "Watch live," I told her. "The highlights lie." Reginald texted a thumbs up and then the word teeth. People were learning my nouns. Washington greeted us with its favorite weather. Important. The hearing room performed itself. Flags watching, microphones pretending to be neutral. I watched the staffers more than I watched the senators. Staffers tell you what the day will mean before the day knows. One young woman with a binder the size of a child looked at me with that particular curiosity, the very competent reserve for the very stubborn. I nodded to her like a compatriot. The chair delivered an opening statement about the tension between innovation and security, which is like talking about the tension between breathing and lungs. The ranking member invoked small businesses, and then his father, and then the internet ate its own tail. A senator from a state that prefers pronouncements to questions asked me if woke ESG was making our country weak. Our insistence on breathable air is making our country durable, I said, and the room's eyebrows went up as if they'd just been informed their job had an additional requirement: sense. When it was my turn to speak, I did not explain the adversary. I explained what we owed to the people who ride the bus. Algorithms, laws, budgets, they have to behave as if the person holding a night shift can't afford to wait for your learning curve. I said, resilience, the way you say, name your dead and then fix the road so the living get home. I pointed to the Tokyo clause without naming it and told the story of a training program in a town that had decided it deserved a future. I said critical systems are boring until they aren't, and the job is to trap the drama in our drafts so the public only ever encounters the routine. Lights that turn on, water that flows, money that arrives where it should without giving its dignity away to thieves. One senator tried to make me say the name of the country that may or may not have been testing our gates. I told him I learned long ago not to identify men in the dark by the size of their boots. Call it what it is when it's daylight and there's paperwork, I said. Until then, move your people. He frowned theatrically. His staffer wrote 3 furious notes, and then, without meaning to, smiled. After the hearing, the corridor performed its own version. Reporters as musicians, cameras as brass. I gave them quotable sentences because if you can't turn a paragraph into a headline, the public can't carry it. Fix the code, pass the audit, leave the door open, I said, and watch the words take off again like birds finding thermals. Adrian leaned against a column, arms folded, watching with anthropologist eyes. You're terrifyingly good at this, he said when we finally made it outside. I teach my students to distrust sound bites. And then you give me sound bites I wish I'd written. I'll license, I said. For pie. On the flight home, we read the first draft of a hit piece aimed at Adrian. Someone had decided that a man with a trust fund should apologize for teaching at a public school. The piece had math like bad grammar and ethics like a performance. He read it once, shrugged, and flagged 2 inaccuracies for his department chair. Do I respond? He asked. Never in their house, I said. Invite them to yours. A panel on class in public institutions. Seminar open to the public. Let their questions stand next to better ones and see if they survive. He smiled. I'll call it office hours. The next days moved like a river we knew how to respect. The Alphabet Fund's first grant went to a small branch library in East Boston with shelves that bent under the weight of other people's dreams. Charlotte presented the check with a sentence that made Reginald close his eyes and swallow. We're learning that generosity doesn't need a spotlight to see. The gallery posted attendance numbers that looked like the city had decided to date art again. The 3 boys with the marker came back twice a week and learned how to hang a show, which is to say, they learned to measure their hands against a wall and find level. Lorenzo called with Paris. He'd found a space that smelled like history and forgotten flour. It's beautiful, he said, but labor rules will require us to be smarter than we are. I booked a flight. We walked the neighborhood like you walk a sentence, testing where it bends, where it resists, where it sings if you don't push. I said yes with conditions. Profit sharing for the kitchen, a childcare stipend that would make newspapers if they wanted to, a partnership with a culinary school that didn't prioritize last names. He laughed and cried in the same phone call in the way only chefs and saints can. You make it hard and easy at once, he said. Same recipe, I said. All good stews start that way. Then life did the thing it does when you start to believe you've got your rhythm. It threw a stone into the measure. Doña Lidia fainted behind the counter on a Wednesday morning with no poetry in it. Her nephew called Adrian because we were the people on his phone who owned a car and a Kong. The ER performed competence without theater. Diagnosis: a heart that had done too much for too long, sending a memo. She would be okay if she allowed herself to be, which is an entire genre of courage. In the hospital chair, Adrian read out loud from a book she hadn't asked for, and she corrected his Spanish because mercy doesn't become less itself under fluorescent lights. I took the night shift in the hard plastic chair that remembers every weight, texting Lorenzo at 3 a.m. for sofrito ratios I didn't need, because sometimes you text people at 3 a.m. to remind the world it has hands. Charlotte arrived at dawn, with coffee, strong enough to lift mistakes, sat and didn't fuss. When the doctor came in, he spoke in English. Charlotte translated into Spanish and then into kindness with the skill of a woman who had decided words belong to anyone who dares use them for good. We closed the bakery for a week. The boys with the marker took shifts covering the morning rush from a borrowed cart. We taught credit card machines to be patient with gloves. We learned again what communities are, but this time with both eyes open. Not charity, not pity, but investment that expects a return called dignity. When Doña Lidia returned to her own counter, the city applauded the way it knows how. One extra empanada ordered, an extra bill left in the tip jar, a joke delivered louder, a slower, better question asked. She pretended to be offended and then sent us home with cake. "For your health," she said, which is how love pronounces itself in kitchens. Through it all, the inbound invitations multiplied. Panels, profiles, dinners. I said no like a doctor writes prescriptions, tailored, firm, with the goal of keeping a system from relying on applause. I said yes to a handful. One was a classroom in the South Bronx where a 12-year-old asked me if money makes you mean. "It makes you more of what you already are," I said. "So practice now." Another was a union hall in Queens, where we argued loudly about automation and then shared rice until the argument understood itself. A third was a high school in Boston where Charlotte introduced me and didn't make a speech about growth. She simply handed me the microphone and sat among the students, a woman who had remembered something she didn't know she'd forgotten. Meanwhile, the adversary learned new dances. We learned better shoes. Arjun hired a cryptographer who wore sweaters like armor and laughed like a bark. Gabriella codified our crisis playbook into something you could teach and then taught it to people who'd never been invited to rooms like these. The president called to say, "Good work," in a voice that suggested the next storm had already named itself. I responded with a sentence about lighthouses and budgets. We understood each other because we had both learned public weather. On a Saturday that felt like a holiday and wasn't, Adrian took me back to the river we loved to pretend as a friend. We walked until the city's conversation softened enough to let another voice in. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. It had been read too many times to still be crisp. "It's the trust language," he said. I added a clause. "Let me guess," I said. "You want to require boredom." He grinned. "Close. If I ever prefer a boardroom to a classroom, the money is obligated to find humor in me and go work for someone else." "Approved," I said, "on one condition. Name it. You make me empanadas for my birthday." "That's extortion," he said. "That's governance," I said. He tucked the paper away like a truce and watched the water argue with light. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked. "Constantly," I said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, then smiled. I thought it would feel like failure. It feels like mileage. We ended that day at the gallery again because addiction to clarity is hereditary. A woman stood in front of the first label, lips moving twice. Her child tugged at her coat, bored and hungry. She shushed him without looking away. When she finished, she exhaled, texted a photograph to a person who mattered, and wiped her eye as if it were a bug. Bella watched from across the room, gave me a look that tasted like relief, and returned to her notes for the next show, which would be louder and softer all at once. In the elevator home, Walter told me the orchid had done something I didn't think botanists allowed. It had produced a spray of blossoms that looked like punctuation trying to be music. "That plant is stubborn," he said and laughed. "It lives here." Sunday dinner came around again, as inevitable and holy as a paycheck. Queens this time. We set tables on the sidewalk because weather had guaranteed us an evening. Neighbors came without invites, the way neighbors do when a smell lives in a block. The boys with the marker brought their grandmother, who corrected all of us and didn't need an explanation for bilingual menus because her life has always insisted on them. Charlotte wore flats. Reginald poured water. Ethan argued with a postal clerk about jazz and Lost. Madeline told a joke about policy so filthy we had to baptize the punch bowl. Lorenzo and Lucia arrived late, smelling like garlic and knives. Arjun and Gabriella brought news. The adversary had tried another door and found a mirror. We ate. We passed plates like letters. We made the circle larger without asking the chairs whether they were tired. When the light faded just enough, Adrian stood up, not to announce or demand, but to invite. Office hours, he said. Tuesday, City College. Topic, who gets to speak? Guests, all of you. Laughter, applause, groans from the shy, an elbow from Bella. After the dishes had been stacked into towers that looked like faith and my feet had told me their opinion of cement, I sat on the stoop with a notebook I'd avoided for years. I wrote to Diego. I told him about the alphabet and the boys and the adversary and the orchid and the way Charlotte says we, now even when nobody's listening. I told him about Adrian's clauses and Bella's labels and the president's stolen sentence. I told him about the Hamptons, about a gull that almost took my sandwich, about a hospital chair and a baker who makes jokes in recovery. I showed him the math we'd written on a life that used to be a budget. I closed the book and didn't feel like I'd buried anything. I felt like I'd planted it. Night came down like a negotiated agreement. People took leftovers home because the only respectable end to abundance is redistribution. Babies went limp in strollers. A bus sighed as if it had something to confess. The city turned its lights on and pretended to be new again. We let it. That is one of our rituals, the mercy of pretending, when it helps. Back upstairs, the apartment accepted us the way a harbor accepts a ship that has learned from its storms. Adrian put on coffee. Bella found the playlist that only plays at this hour. My phone sat face down until it didn't. A text from Paris. Contract agreed, profit share in, child care in, school in, risotto unchanged. A text from the reporter. Ran the story on the gallery email. The comments were better than the internet deserves. A text from Charlotte. Sent the Alphabet Fund paperwork. Wrote no plaque. A text from Reginald. Library's carpet is ugly. I'm fixing it. Don't tell anyone. A text from Doña Lidia. Your boy sliced onions wrong. I told him. He laughed. Come early tomorrow. We stood at the window because we always do. The river was itself. The bridges bragged quietly. Somewhere, a person chose to do the right thing because a label was the same size in two languages, and they were tired of pretending that one voice meant more. Somewhere, a server shut off a light and carried home a cake box without dropping it. Somewhere, a senator read a brief that taught him the difference between volume and value. Somewhere, a boy put a marker back in a drawer and decided to keep it there a little longer. Adrian leaned his shoulder against mine. What now? He asked. More of this, I said. And then whatever tries to stop it. You think it will? He said. It always does, I said. The door is open. That's the whole point and the whole problem. He laughed. Fix the code, pass the audit, he said. And leave the door open, I finished, and the words felt both like work and like sleep. We turned off the lights one by one, which is not how you end a story, but how you keep it from burning out too fast. The city kept going without us for a few hours, which is one of the great reliefs of living where you do not have to be a hero to be useful. In the morning we would start again. Grammar, governance, garlic. The alphabet refuses stairs, the music knows the steps. The flyers said office hours in a font that didn't try too hard, taped crookedly across the hallway walls at City College, like a promise that belonged to anyone willing to claim it. Room 318 had the bad acoustics of a place that had never expected to be important. The chairs squeaked, the windows coughed, the projector blinked like it was considering retirement. Adrian stood at the front in a navy shirt he'd ironed with his palms and a smile he hadn't, nervous and certain in the exact ratio I trust. On the board, he'd written the only instructions that mattered. Who gets to speak? What do we owe each other when we do? They came early. Students with backpacks that sounded like the future when they hit the floor. A custodian who'd finished her shift and stayed because her niece said this professor made sentences feel like doorways. The three boys from the gallery slipped in and tried to act native to the space. The youngest took a seat at the end of the front row and didn't make eye contact with anyone for 3 full minutes. Charlotte and Reginald arrived without announcement, sat on the aisle, and wore their name tags from the gallery like new habits. Bella rolled in with a borrowed mic and a stack of handwritten questions that didn't care about reputation. I stood in the back with coffee that would get a C+ and watched the room find its temperature. Adrian opened with a joke about grading in the dark. People laughed, then listened. "We're here to practice a thing most rooms pretend they already know how to do," he said. "Disagree without performing. Speak without leaving anyone smaller. If we do it wrong, we'll know. If we do it right, we'll hear it." He gestured to the first student and sat on the edge of the desk like the ground should be shared. A hand went up. A kid in a denim jacket with a patch that said "No gods, no gurus, no algorithms." He asked if privilege can ever be ethical. If money can pass an audit for decency. A girl with braids and a notebook full of courage said she didn't want to be anyone's teachable moment anymore. The custodian explained how the overnight quiet on campus is a kind of knowledge nobody pays for. The youngest of the 3 boys cleared his throat and read a sentence from a poem he'd memorized because it tasted like home, then looked shocked at his own voice. 20 minutes in, the projector died with the theatrical finality of a diva, and the room gently applauded its passing. We didn't need it. We had faces and syllables. We had a chalkboard that still remembered ghosts. Adrian handed the mic to Bella. She spoke about labels and walls, about the way a city learns to read itself. She told them that respect is cheaper than you think and worth more than you'll ever have to spend. Charlotte lifted her hand halfway, and then, when Adrian nodded, raised it the rest of the way, with the bravery of a woman trying on a language in public. "I used to think rooms like this were for my announcements," she said. "I'm practicing learning in them instead." It landed with the precise click of a lock turning. A boy in the back stood to challenge Adrian. Loud, certain, the kind of certainty the internet rewards with followers. "You've got a trust fund," he said. "You shouldn't be at a public school taking a spot from somebody who needs it." The room went still in that way rooms do when they realize they're about to be asked to be better than they were yesterday. Adrian nodded. "I do have a trust," he said evenly. "I also have rules I wrote for it, because I didn't want easy money to make me lazy in ways that would feel expensive later. I teach here because I believe public is not the opposite of excellent. If you still think the money disqualifies the work, then the work isn't good enough yet. Hold me to it. That's what this place is for." He pointed to the board. "Next question. Who gets access? Not just to funds, but to forgiveness. Who gets the benefit of the doubt when they speak?" A quiet girl with glitter on her eyelids said nobody had ever stopped to explain how to ask for help without sounding like audition. The custodian said she'd written her first email with the subject line, "I hope this isn't a problem," and it had been a thank you to the financial aid office for answering the phone on a Friday. The room laughed and winced in the same breath. The door opened near the end, and a woman slipped in wearing a scarf I recognized. The vice chair from the donor circle stood at the back, 2 fingers on the doorframe like she was asking the architecture for permission. She listened. I watched her face lose angles. When Adrian invited comments from the hall, she cleared her throat. "I sit on boards that like to choreograph gratitude," she said. "I'm learning to prefer rooms that choreograph questions." Then she turned to the students. "What do you want your donors to understand that we never seem to hear?" 15 hands went up so fast it looked like a field turning toward the sun. I stepped sideways and smiled, because some conversions don't need a camera to count. Afterward, the hallway turned into a small, dignified riot. People who never talked to each other were suddenly trying to catch up on years of silence. The projector decided to come back to life at exactly the wrong time, which made everyone clap for the wrong reason, which felt perfect. The boy who'd challenged Adrian asked for his office hours and actually meant to come. The youngest of the 3 said thank you to Charlotte in Spanish, and she said de nada without apology. Reginald offered to fund a book grant and didn't ask for a plaque. He asked for a receipt and then looked at me and shrugged like a man practicing a tonality that didn't include his own name. In the middle of that soft chaos, my phone vibrated. Not with news, but with a siren I'd assigned to calls that could reorder a decade. An investment bank I had said no to 3 times wanted to make a 4th attempt, an offer to take MFS public on terms that assumed I'd grown tired of the private work and was ready to be a public commodity. I looked at Adrian, at the chalk on his sleeves, at Bella in conversation with a sophomore who gestured like a conductor warming up an orchestra. I listened to the building breathe. I walked into an empty classroom and took the call. They offered me a number that would impress a planet. They said words like liquidity event and legacy, as if the only way to last is to sell your story to people who will never read it again. I asked them to tell me how public money would make our systems more durable, how a quarterly performance would hold a lighthouse steady in bad weather. They deflected with the skill of professionals who mistake polish for proof. I said no, again, without softness and without spectacle. We're not a balloon you take outside to watch the wind, I said. We're a bridge. Bridges don't go public, they hold. I hung up and laughed into the empty room at my own metaphors that refused to relax. Back in the hallway, a reporter with a camera the size of a debt asked for a quote about the new fund. Charlotte stepped forward before I could, eyes steady, voice plain. We made a rule, she said. We support words in the order they live, in the mouths of people who use them to work. It wasn't poetry, and it didn't need to be. The camera blinked as if grateful for the sentence that wouldn't need an edit. That night, we took the long way home through the city's quiet, which is a sound more complicated than most symphonies. We stopped at the library we'd funded in East Boston because Reginald wanted to see how ugly the carpet really was. He stood in the reading room like a man measuring a promise against the shape of his own hand. I can fix this, he said softly. I can fix this without anybody knowing it was broken. Charlotte touched his shoulder and didn't make it about them. Bella picked up a book left open on a table and read the last line out loud in both languages. It landed differently each time, and somehow meant the same thing. Go on. At the apartment, Walter told me the orchid had decided to get ambitious. It was throwing new shoots like it had read a growth forecast and approved. In the kitchen, we opened nothing fancy and toasted to office hours and to rooms that make their own weather. Adrian washed mugs. Bella wrote notes for a wall she hadn't been asked to build yet. The city outside rehearsed tomorrow. My phone stayed face down until it didn't. A text from Arjun. Advisory, possible recon from a new vector, we're ready. I sent back a thumbs up and the word steady. He replied with a checkmark and the word teeth. Near midnight, the balcony took us into its version of church. The river was law-abiding under the bridge's patient tyranny. Somewhere, Lorenzo was writing a menu note for Paris about childcare and profit shares and insisting his signature risotto would not change just because a neighborhood did. Somewhere, the three boys were trying out a story in which they showed up at a gallery to cause trouble and left knowing how to level a chair. Somewhere, a senator was practicing a question that sounded less like a performance and more like care. Somewhere, a donor read a bilingual label out loud to hear how her own mouth could carry more than one music. The world didn't tilt, but it did nod. Tomorrow, Adrian said, and the word did its usual magic trick, turned dread into appointment. Queens, I said, then East Boston if the carpet can't wait. Then whatever thinks it can outshout a clause we wrote in good faith. He grinned. I let myself imagine how a life like this looks from very far away. Noise and headlines and toast after toast, but up close it's just hands, on mugs, on chalk, on the underside of a chair, steadying as somebody else climbs. I slept a little. The city did not. In the morning my inbox contained the only apology that has ever mattered, one from the vice chair written without a lawyer. I confused the comfort of a few with the welcome owed to many. I'll be different tomorrow. It's not a promise I would put on paper for a bond issue. It was enough for a day. I forwarded it to Bella without comment. She replied with a heart and a photo of a new label, Spanish and English kissing in the middle like a vow. On the way out the door, I grabbed the stack of rules Adrian had drafted for the trust and slid them into my bag. He'd included a final clause scrawled in the margin last minute, an afterthought that felt like architecture. If our money ever starts to sound like a monologue, buy more chairs. I laughed alone in the elevator because there are sentences you spend your whole life training to deserve, and then one day your child writes one for you. The doors opened on morning. We stepped in. The city made room. The rain started with the certainty of a scheduled meeting, pinning itself to the city in sheets that made everything look like a confession. By late afternoon, Water bullied its way down subway steps, sirens rehearsed a chorus, and a transformer somewhere uptown made a sound like a verdict. At 5:41 p.m., the lights inside my office blinked twice. The elegant stutter of a grid deciding it might be tired of being taken for granted, and then half of Manhattan exhaled into darkness. Phones lit up like votives. Arjun appeared in my doorway already on 2 calls, eyes telling me what his mouth didn't need to. Localized outages rolling south, he said. Legacy relays don't like this much water. We're stable, but EBT, payroll, hospital billing. If the state's vendor drops packets, we'll feel it. Do we open the valves? Open them, I said. We didn't design a backstop to admire it. He nodded, peeled off toward the war room. Screens swung to life on generator hum, our systems drinking power from our bones, the way a body does when it refuses to be sick. In the dark glass, my reflection looked older and exactly my age. I texted Adrian one word, storms. He replied with a pin from City College and a photo of a classroom full of students holding flashlights like they were about to tell a ghost story and had decided to be brave instead. The first call came from a hospital CFO in the Bronx, voice strained into politeness. Our claims gateway is hitching, she said. If this goes past 6, nurses don't clock out, night crew doesn't clock in, and my billing department becomes a choir. We'll route you through us, I said. You'll get a half-hour buffer on punches and a promise not to make you worship at a spreadsheet tomorrow. She laughed, surprised at herself. You talk like a person, she said. I forget how useful that is. I'll take that as a prescription, I answered. We'll call if we need a refill. By 6:10, our ESG auditors had pivoted to crisis mode because they know that insisting on clean air doesn't absolve you from dirty weather. Gabriella stood over the map like a general who hates war. Snap authorizations are bottlenecking, she said. If the state vendor stalls, people can't buy dinner. I didn't pretend to be neutral. Flip them onto our rails, I said. We'll reconcile the paperwork at 3 a.m. and apologize to the accountants with pie. Copy, she said, dialing. I'll call Doña Lidia, I added, already typing. She'll need extra flour. The neighborhood is about to start feeding itself. My phone buzzed with Charlotte's name. We're in East Boston at the library, she said, wind loud in the line. Power's patchy, but there are 50 people in here charging phones and reading by window. The carpet looks worse in candlelight, by the way. I could hear Reginald in the background negotiating with a breaker panel like it owed him a favor. Tell them to keep the doors open until the storm surrenders, I said. I'll cover whatever needs covering. And Char, hang bilingual signs for the outlets. No stairs for the alphabet tonight. She laughed. Already printed. At 6:42, Adrian called from 20 blocks away. We've got students funneling people off flooded platforms, he said. I'm sending a few to Doña Lidia's with cash. We'll run a tab in empanadas and forgiveness. Tell them to move like water, I said. And keep your feet dry. Heroics look bad when they cough. Bella texted a photo from the gallery. A room full of strangers holding their phones over labels, 2 languages reflecting back at 24 faces, light borrowed and given. Beneath her caption, closing late. Art doesn't mind the dark. The 3 boys, my marker crew, were in the corner stacking chairs like a prayer you say with your hands. By 7, the city had organized itself the way it always does when official plans hit weather. Bodegas extended their hours by instinct. Neighbors looked like leaders, and my inbox shifted from threat to need. We throttled throughput. We bought the time we couldn't afford. We lied to no one. Arjun's team caught a rash of fishing that tried to parasitize the chaos. Our decoys swallowed them whole and lit up a signature we'd been courting for months. Same state as before? He asked. We don't say the name in the dark, I said. We thank the storm for drawing them out. At 7:28, an email landed from a state deputy director who once believed my claws work was theater. Subject line, help, body, we're drowning. Can you handle WIC authorizations until morning? I'll owe you. I typed the only sentence that matters when money is supposed to keep people alive, on it. Paperwork later. He replied with what I imagine contrition looks like in Helvetica. Thank you. We spun up the rails. Somewhere in Queens, a mother put milk on a counter and didn't have to argue with a machine. Walter called from the penthouse. I've got candles, the orchid thinks it's Christmas, and the building is pretending to be stoic, he said. Do you need me anywhere? Open the terrace to the floor, I said. If power stays out, folks are going to need a high place to breathe. Copy, he said, and then, your boy? Feet dry, I said. Mouth busy. Same as always. At 8, the storm stopped performing and started meaning it. A gust slapped the glass like a dare. The grid hiccuped again, our generators yawned and kept singing, and a packet capture threw up a flag that made Arjun stand absolutely still. They're crawling the backup name servers, he said. Hiding in the rain. We'd hardened those precisely for nights like this. I thought of Diego, chalk on his fingers, explaining redundancy as a kind of love. Shut the tunnels, I said. Give them a maze that feels like progress. Bella called at 8:16. A man just asked if the Spanish is really necessary in an emergency, she said, voice level. I told him clarity is a kind of first aid. Good, I said. Tell him the soup line is labeled in both languages, too. Already served him, she said. He said thank you in Spanish by accident. The best kind, I said. Accidents that stick. At 9:03, Reginald sent a selfie I'd never have expected 6 months ago. Him on a step stool in a suit, replacing a library light with his own hands, smile sheepish and honest. Beneath it, ugly carpet fixed next week. No plaque. Charlotte followed with a video of a kid reading aloud under that light while the storm failed at the windows. Progress isn't theatrical. It's a bulb at the right height of a long night. The worst of it passed by 10. The grid shook itself like a dog coming out of a river and decided to remember its job. We kept our rails open longer than we had to because obligation feels better when it's generous. At 10:47, the hospital CFO called back just to say we made it, and I said you did, and we agreed without saying it that this is how a city reminds itself what functioning looks like, invisible and full of teeth. When the work lowered its voice, I drove through streets that slicked my tires into humility. The city shone in weird places. The puddle that held a billboard like a different kind of truth. A lobby full of candles and mason jars. A bus stop where a boy held his grandmother's purse like a promotion. I stopped at Doña Lidia's. The gate was half down and still leaking light. Inside, the counter was covered in paper bags with names written in 2 hands. She looked smaller but more herself. For your warriors, she said, packing an extra into my arms, and for the children who didn't cry. We'll audit the dough, I said. We already did, she replied. We're rich in receipts that matter. Back at the penthouse, Walter had turned the place into a station. Lanterns, blankets, a tray of tea that insisted on being grandmother. On the terrace, neighbors who'd never met were trading storms like recipes. Charlotte and Reginald came in damp from the car, hair misbehaving, faces bright with the kind of usefulness money rarely lets you feel. Bella arrived with 2 docents and a grandmother who'd never been north of 96th, and now had a story about a gallery that stayed open when the city tried closing. The 3 boys stacked what needed stacking, quiet and proud. Adrian walked in last, shoes muddy, eyes awake. He handed me a plastic poncho like an award. Office hours? He said, field edition. We circled up because bodies know how. No speech, no toast. Just the funneled quiet that comes when the insistence of the day releases you and leaves behind something clean. The power crept back on across the river in squares of pixelated sunrise, windows swallowing darkness, whistle by whistle. My phone pinged twice, Argent, all green. Good signatures captured. We'll brief at 8. The state deputy, debrief tomorrow. You saved us tonight? I typed to Arjun, teeth saved. To the deputy, not saved. Practiced. Practice is the whole job. Near midnight, the wind tried for one last flourish and failed. I poured tea that tasted like permission. The room took up its old beloved argument about jazz and commas, and I let it because joy is a load-bearing beam. Adrian leaned on the railing, shoulder touching mine, the city doing that trick where it turns into a map of every decision you've ever made. You always look most yourself on nights like this, he said. Like the code is a language you're thinking in. I'm just a plumber with thesaurus, I said. But yes, this is what we built it for. Not applause, continuity, he nodded. Tomorrow I'm bringing my students to the library. The carpet needs witnesses. Bring chairs, I said, in case the alphabet gets tired. He laughed. Bella slid in on my other side, chin on my shoulder. Our poet wants to print her storm piece on the wall. 2 languages, no stairs. Standard, I said. We'll buy the ink. The orchid, ridiculous and brave, had thrown off a final bloom in the wind. Walter pointed like a proud uncle. "This plant refuses to read the manual," he said. "We should keep it." "We should learn from it," I said. The room went warm with the kind of laughter that fixes nothing and makes fixing possible. I slept for 3 hours like a person who had delegated well. In the morning, the city tried a smile. The subways were late and then right, coffee tasted like heroism, and 1,000 small systems ticked into place because enough people decided to keep them there. In my inbox, a note from the vice chair saw the storm post. "We'll fund battery backups for neighborhood galleries, no ribbons." A note from the hospital CFO. "We're sending our IT kid to you for a week. Teach him you're stubborn." A note from the president's chief of staff. "He used your line on continuity. He credited you. Recording attached." I didn't press play. I didn't need to hear my words come back to know they'd found work. On the way to the office, I detoured by the Queen's Library. The new carpet was ugly in that specific way municipal solutions are: durable, forgiving, hard to stain. Children crawled on it, with books like promises. Reginald stood in the corner with a custodian discussing adhesive, like it was policy. Charlotte sat cross-legged reading to a boy who interrupted to correct her Spanish and then apologized like honesty needed permission. It doesn't. We're learning that. By noon, Arjun's briefing was done. The adversary chased mirrors, we caught prints, the claws held, the rails held, the city held. We made a list of what we'd improve and pretended it wasn't also a prayer. Gabriella updated our playbook and then sent a copy to a union hall in Queens. "They asked," she said. "We're not noble enough to decline." In the afternoon, I walked the gallery once, alone. The labels were still up, the paper a little wavy from night air, the edges browned into character. In the quiet, I heard the sentence our poet had taped to the wall while I slept. "We speak twice, so the city can't pretend it didn't hear us." Underneath it, someone had written in a child's hand, in English and Spanish, the thing I keep trying to say with code and clauses and dinners and rules and storms: "Thank you for leaving the door open." The city stepped into mourning like it was holding a last note. The council chamber was packed, ceiling lights bright in that hospital way, microphones hissing a reminder that everything here would be recorded and later used as evidence. Outside, the lines snaked the stone steps. The sky looked as if someone had wiped it with a dish towel. On the docket, the bilingual labeling standard for public spaces. A dry title everyone knew had been born from a wet night, from rippled sheets of paper and the sentence we'd been repeating until it turned into policy. "The alphabet doesn't do stairs." I stood at the back where the light doesn't force anyone to perform. Adrian hunched in the public row, chalk still ghosting his sleeves, fingers drumming the rhythm of office hours. Bella held a crumpled stack, part remarks, part map, eyes straight, choice made. Charlotte and Reginald sat side by side, wearing nothing that gleamed. They wore their names by staying quiet at the right times. The first to testify was an older woman who reads at the East Boston branch. No dedicated mic, her voice had its own electricity. "I read English slower," she said, "but when the Spanish is the same size, I don't feel invited to stand on a lower step." The room slipped into that rare silence that lets a city see its own face. Bella went next. She told them about the first room that smelled like paint and patience, about 3 boys with a black marker, about the man who asked whether Spanish was really necessary in an emergency, and the bowl of soup that answered for us. "Respect is first aid," Bella said, "and first aid has to come in the language of the person bleeding." A council member frowned and invoked conversion costs. I watched Gabriella lean and murmur into her phone, firing a spreadsheet into their inboxes. Line items for signage, training hours, risk buffers, set beside measurable gains in return visits, reach, and a column labeled public reputation, the value that gets erased in rooms like this. A moment later, Arjun texted, "Numbers landed." On the dice, a few eyes moved from resistance to calculation, then softened at the edges. Charlotte raised her hand, not as a donor, just a citizen. "We were wrong," she said, voice flat as a mirror put in the right place. "We confused the comfort of a few with the welcome owed to many. From today, our family fund ties money only to outcomes measured in people, not in plaques." Reginald added nothing. He nodded, the kind of nod that sounds like a signature. A bodega owner stood and described the blackout. EBT machines choking, the shop turning into a checkpoint, hand-lettered stickers becoming a map. "I don't need a logo," he said. "I need letters big enough so Abuela doesn't have to borrow a grandkid just to buy milk." The chamber laughed, the kind of laugh with a confession inside it. My turn. I didn't read from the prepared copy. I talked about the unelected laws we write as algorithms, about audits with teeth that had saved a storm night from turning biblical, about how a city stays durable by choosing the decisions that make the night ordinary again. "This change costs less than a burned house," I said, "and it hurts less than looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself." The last volley came from a councilman who prefers traditional subtitles. "Wasn't this woke politics and policies clothing?" "No," I said, "it's CPR for a democracy that can read." The room made a sound, not because it was clever, but because it hit where the bruise lives. Vote. Green lights popped on down the row like the windows across the river that blink themselves awake every evening. The standard passed with a clear majority, tagged with an appendix Gabriella had drafted. A quarter-by-quarter rollout, testing criteria, ready-to-use templates, and a small incentive, an alphabet credit, for any site that exceeded access standards. The sentence, "The alphabet doesn't do stairs," had found its way into a public document without quotation marks. The hallway turned into a small market of good news. The librarian waved to the gallerist. The bodega owner swapped numbers with a teacher. Adrian posted a special office hours topic, "Who gets to speak when the law finally leans toward smaller voices?" The youngest of the three marker boys high-fived Adrian, then turned to Charlotte and said, "Gracias," each syllable clean. We drove to Queens. Doña Lidia had opened the oven like an umbrella. Outside, the sun poured honey. Inside, a line curled past the door. The latch cracked so the street could carry the smell. "Law went through?" she asked without checking her phone. "Law went through," I said. She nodded, slipped 2 extra pastries into my bag, and tucked in a warning. "Law is one thing. Keeping the habit is the other." I pocketed the sentence like a small knife, good for peeling apples, useful for remembering. That night, the penthouse terrace worked like a station. No speeches. Fruit on plates, more chairs dragged out, the stubborn orchid insisting on one more bud. Ethan brought the cheapest bottle he could find to remind us money has no taste. Madeline told the story of a comma that saved a community proposal from getting swallowed. Arjun reported, "A familiar source tried again, still loves mirrors more than doors." Teeth. Sharp. Gabriella set a thick packet on the table. 2 language starter kit for small places. PDF, printable, tape-ready, deployable tomorrow morning. Bella rested her chin on my shoulder. "I'm hanging a new poem tomorrow," she said. 2 languages, no one standing on a lower step. Adrian handed me a page, once crumpled, now clean. The new trust clause. "If the money starts to sound like a monologue, buy more chairs." I dated it, signed it, and smiled. There are sentences you spend a lifetime trying to deserve. Sometimes your child writes one for you. Charlotte moved quietly, never touching the center, asking each person in a low voice, "How can we help without our name attached?" Reginald stood at the rail, watching the river, saying to himself, "Ugly carpets still deserve to be clean." I didn't edit him. Sometimes a man needs to make peace with a carpet before he can make peace with his habits. Messages arrived like fireflies from the library. They'd labeled every outlet, Tomas, from the governor's office, an invitation to help draft statewide standards. From Lorenzo in Paris, a photo of the menu board with a new children's corner. Changing table, small chairs, kitchen opening early. "Risotto unchanged," he wrote. "Tables sit lower." I heard Diego laughing on the back porch. Near midnight, the city did its favorite trick, pretending to be brand new. River lights blinked, a tour boat murmured, the bridge moved wind between unfinished sentences. I leaned on the rail and ran the line again in my head. Fix the code, pass the audit, leave the door open. The door isn't for showing off. It's so the next person doesn't have to knock. After everyone left, only the sound of plates in the sink and water, like a song without words, remained. Adrian asked, "What first tomorrow?" "Send the toolkit to places that don't even know our email," I said. "Then go put a label where nobody asked for one. Teach the street to expect beautiful text." He lifted an eyebrow. "Where?" I pointed down at the laundry on the corner, its hand-lettered sign, "Se habla, we speak," shaky but upright. where they got it right before the law. Night wrapped us in river smell. The orchid kept deciding to bloom. Somewhere in a small apartment, a child braided gracias and thank you into a word of their own. At a bus stop, a girl read both lines on a notice out loud and smiled because she didn't have to choose. At a kitchen table, a mother wrote down the office hours number and decided to carry her question into a squeaky-chaired classroom. A city doesn't shed its skin because of one vote. It changes by habit. And tonight, I watched that habit start to stand upright, without climbing a single stair.